On the day Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg married King Alfonso XIII of Spain, a bomb landed 30 feet from their carriage. The street was lined with crowds. The bunting was still moving in the Madrid breeze. The bride was 19 years old, dressed in silver and white, and the blood that covered her wedding gown by the time the carriage reached the palace was not her own. 23 people died on the Calle Mayor that morning. The King and Queen of Spain walked into their wedding reception past the evidence of an assassination attempt that had failed by a margin too close to calculate comfortably, and the reception proceeded, because in the world they inhabited, the reception was always required to proceed. Ina, as she was known to the family she had left behind in England, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who had grown up in the particular atmosphere of a British royal household, and who had converted to Catholicism and learned Spanish and crossed the Channel to become a queen, survived the bomb without visible injury. She survived the wedding day. She survived the first years of the marriage, which were years of public glamour and private negotiation of the kind that royal marriages always involve, when two people from entirely different worlds are placed in the same institution and required to make it work. What she did not survive, in any meaningful sense, was the birth of her first son. The boy was haemophiliac, the blood that would not clot properly, the genetic inheritance that Queen Victoria had passed to several of her descendants and that had already devastated the Russian imperial family through Alexandra's son Alexei, had passed through Enna to the heir to the Spanish throne. Alfonso, King of Spain, learned this at the circumcision of his firstborn child, when the bleeding that should have stopped did not stop, and the doctors could not explain why, and the king looked at his British wife and began, in that moment, a process of withdrawal that would last for the remainder of their marriage. He blamed her. He said so. He said it in private, and he said it in public, and he said it in the hearing of the people around the court, who were always listening and always remembering, and the saying of it shaped everything that followed, shaped Ina's position in the Spanish court, shaped the marriage that continued around the blame without ever recovering from it, shaped the children who were born into a household where one parent's love was conditional on a genetic fact that the other parent had not chosen and could not change. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had not known. This is the detail that the blame required to be ignored and that history has generally permitted to be ignored. That Ina was a carrier of the haemophilia gene without knowing she was a carrier. That the knowledge available to medicine in 1906 was insufficient to have told her what she was passing on, and that the conversion and the learning and the crossing of the Channel had been done in good faith by a young woman who had no reason to believe she was carrying something that would destroy the thing she was building. Alfonso never accepted this, or accepted it intellectually and rejected it emotionally, which is the form that blame takes when it has nowhere rational to go and goes somewhere irrational instead. He had wanted a dynasty. He had married a healthy young British princess and converted her to his faith and placed her on his throne, and she had given him a haemophiliac heir, and the gap between what he had wanted and what he had received was a gap that he crossed by placing her on the wrong side of it. She stayed. For 25 years she stayed, through the children who followed, through the affairs that Alfonso conducted with a flagrance that the Spanish court observed and the Spanish press periodically reported, through the isolation that the court inflicted on a foreign queen who had committed the unforgivable act of introducing bad blood into the royal line. She stayed through the political convulsions that eventually ended the monarchy, through the exile that followed, through the final dissolution of a marriage that had been dissolving for 2 decades before it formally ended. She carried more than haemophilia into the Spanish throne. She carried the particular dignity of a woman who had been blamed for something she did not do, and who had decided, in the face of that blame, not to become the thing the blame required her to be. The palace wanted the world to see a queen who had poisoned the dynasty. What Ina actually was turned out to be considerably more difficult to dismiss. Victoria Eugenie Julia Enna of Battenberg was born on the 24th of October, 1887, at Balmoral Castle, which is the kind of biographical detail that sounds like destiny, and was, in practice, simply the consequence of her mother being in Scotland when the pregnancy reached its conclusion. She was the only daughter of Prince Henry of Battenberg and Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's youngest child and most constant companion, and the circumstances of her birth placed her inside the innermost circle of the Victorian court, without placing her anywhere near the line of succession that would have made that proximity politically significant. The Battenberg family occupied a specific and somewhat uncomfortable position in the European royal landscape of the late 19th century. They were royal, the title was genuine, the lineage was real, but they were royal in the morganatic sense that the German princely system produced when a prince of a reigning house married beneath the rank that strict dynastic protocol required. Prince Alexander of Hesse had married Julia von Hauke, a Polish countess whose birth was sufficiently noble to be acceptable in most European drawing rooms and insufficiently royal to satisfy the requirements of the Almanach de Gotha, the publication that functioned as the definitive ranking system for European aristocracy, and that the royal houses of the continent used to determine who was marriageable and who was not. The children of this union were given the title of Battenberg, a small castle in Hesse that provided the name without providing the full dynastic standing that a purely royal match would have produced. They were, in the vocabulary of the time, serene highnesses rather than royal highnesses, which sounds like a distinction without a difference, and was, in the world they inhabited, a distinction that determined everything from the order in which you entered a room to the pool of people you were considered eligible to marry. Princess Beatrice's marriage to Henry of Battenberg in 1885 had itself been controversial precisely because of this status question. Queen Victoria had initially resisted the match, not because she disliked Henry, who was charming and good-looking and entirely suitable in personal terms, but because the Battenberg connection carried the morganatic taint that made the family less than fully royal in the eyes of the German courts, that the British royal family's marriage network was most closely entangled with. The resistance had eventually yielded, partly because Beatrice's happiness mattered to her mother, and partly because the practical arrangement that the marriage produced. Henry and Beatrice would live at court with the Queen, providing Beatrice with a husband while ensuring she remained available as Victoria's companion, was too convenient to sacrifice to dynastic principle. Anna grew up inside this arrangement, which is to say, she grew up inside the Victorian court itself, in the immediate proximity of her grandmother. The proximity was not simply geographical. Victoria had strong opinions about the upbringing of her grandchildren, particularly the ones who lived within her reach, and Anna's childhood was shaped by those opinions in the specific way that childhoods are shaped when the most powerful person in the room has views about how children should be raised and the authority to act on them. She was a pretty child, and then a beautiful young woman, with the fair colouring and the particular quality of British rose and cream complexion that the late Victorian era considered its ideal of feminine appearance. She had blue eyes and blonde hair, and the physical ease of someone who had grown up in country houses and Scottish castles, and who had spent enough time outdoors to carry herself with the unconsidered confidence that physical competence in childhood produces. She was also intelligent, though the intelligence was of the kind that the education available to women of her class and period was not designed to develop, and that expressed itself therefore in the social rather than the academic register, a quick reading of people, a facility for the conversation that royal occasions required, a capacity for managing the complex social dynamics of court life that she had absorbed from childhood observation of the master practitioner. Her father died in 1896, when Ina was 8 years old. Henry of Battenberg had volunteered for the Ashanti expedition in West Africa, an act of personal bravery and possibly personal restlessness, since his life at the Victorian court, however comfortable, had not provided the military man with the active service his training had prepared him for. He contracted malaria on the expedition and died on the ship returning to England before reaching home. Ina's childhood thereafter was shaped by the specific quality of a household organized around grief and duty. Her mother's grief, managed in the Victorian manner of absolute and sustained mourning, and her mother's duty to the grandmother, whose companionship the marriage had been designed to preserve. The household at court was not unhappy in any simple sense. It was simply colored, in the way that households are colored by the dominant emotional atmosphere of the people who run them, by loss, and by the dignified management of loss that Beatrice had absorbed from the mother, who was herself the defining exemplar of royal widowhood. Ina grew up watching two women manage the absence of the men they had loved with a public composure that she would, in her own life, have considerable occasion to draw on. Her grandmother died in January 1901, when Ina was 13. The death of Victoria reorganized the entire European royal landscape, because Victoria's network of family connections across the continent, the web of marriages through which her children and grandchildren occupied positions in the royal houses of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Norway and Spain, had been maintained partly by her personal authority and partly by the simple fact of her central position as grandmother to half the crowned heads of Europe. Without her at the center, the web remained, but the maintenance of it required more active management from the people it connected. Enna's mother Beatrice retreated further into the world of duty and memorial that had characterized her adult life. She became the keeper of Victoria's memory, editing her journals, managing the archive of the Queen's correspondence, ensuring that the image of the grandmother was preserved in the form that the family considered appropriate. This work was consuming and important, and left Beatrice relatively little attention for the social life that would have been the normal mechanism for introducing a royal daughter to the European marriage market. Ina therefore came of age in a household that was simultaneously at the center of the British royal family and at the periphery of its active social world, connected to everyone who mattered through her grandmother's legacy and the family network that legacy had produced, but not positioned in the way that daughters of more centrally placed royal parents were positioned, not actively managed toward the dynastic marriage that her looks and her royal blood made theoretically possible. The Spanish connection arrived through channels that had more to do with diplomatic necessity and personal charm than with any systematic management of Enna's marriage prospects. Alfonso XIII of Spain, young, energetic, constitutionally king from birth following his father's death before Alfonso was born, was in the market for a queen in the early 1900s, in the practical sense that a king without an heir is always in the market for a queen, and the European royal family had a limited supply of suitable candidates. He visited England in 1905. The visit was a state occasion, managed with the formality that state occasions between allied monarchies required, and it produced the usual round of dinners and receptions and carefully arranged social occasions at which the visiting monarch encountered the people his hosts considered worth encountering. Ina was among those people, not as a candidate, not as someone who had been positioned for his attention, but as a member of the extended royal family, whose presence at court occasions was natural rather than calculated. Alfonso noticed her. The noticing was immediate and genuine, by all accounts of people present, for the occasions when the two of them were in the same room, and it produced in the young king a pursuit that was conducted with the directness that his character inclined toward, and that Spanish royal protocol permitted, in ways that the more constrained British equivalent did not. He wanted to marry her. The want was expressed clearly and pursued actively, and the pursuit produced, across the months between the initial meeting and the formal engagement, a process of negotiation and adjustment that Ina navigated from a position of genuine uncertainty about what saying yes actually meant. It meant converting. The Spanish throne was Catholic in a way that was not simply denominational but constitutional. The Queen of Spain was required to be Catholic, and Enna was Anglican, and the conversion that was required of her was not a private matter of personal faith, but a public act with political implications that the British press debated and the British royal family viewed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. She converted. She learned Spanish. She left England for a country she had never visited and a role she had never prepared for, following a man she had known for less than a year, into an institution whose internal culture was entirely unlike the one she had grown up in, and whose welcome of a foreign Protestant-turned-Catholic bride would prove, in the years ahead, to be considerably cooler than the warmth of the public celebration on the Calle Maya suggested. The bomb that landed 30 feet from her carriage on the wedding day was the first indication that the Spain she had married into was not the Spain that the formal occasions had presented. It was not the last. The others were quieter, and more sustained, and more personally directed, and they came not from anarchists in the crowd, but from the institution she had just joined, and the man who had just married her. The wedding day ended with blood on her dress, and a city in shock, and a king who had survived to reign another day, and a queen who had survived to discover what surviving inside that particular marriage was actually going to require of her. She had converted and crossed the channel, and stood in the Calle Mayor, while the world exploded around her. She had not yet begun to understand what she had walked into. The morning of the 31st of May 1906 began with the kind of ceremonial precision that royal weddings require, and that Madrid had been preparing for weeks. The streets along the processional route had been decorated with the particular extravagance that Spanish public celebrations produced when the occasion was sufficiently significant. Bunting and flowers, and the portraits of the king and his new queen, displayed in the windows of buildings whose owners understood that proximity to the route was an opportunity for the demonstration of loyalty that the moment required. The crowd was genuine rather than assembled. Alfonso was not universally popular in the way that monarchs who have survived multiple assassination attempts and governed through sustained political turbulence are rarely universally popular. But the wedding of a young king to a beautiful British princess was a spectacle that transcended the ordinary divisions of Spanish political life, and the people who lined the Calle Mayor that morning had come because they wanted to see it, rather than because anyone had required them to. Ina had left the royal palace of Madrid in the open carriage that the route and the occasion demanded, wearing the dress that had been made in England and shipped to Spain, and that represented, in its silver and white and the elaborate lace of its construction, the aesthetic ambitions of a court that understood that royal weddings were not simply personal occasions, but statements about the monarchy's capacity for magnificence. She was 19 years old, and she had been in Spain for less than a month, and the crowds lining the route were the crowds of a city she was still learning to read. Alfonso rode beside her. He was 20 years old, dark-eyed and slender, and possessed of the particular physical confidence that young men who have been kings from birth sometimes carry, the ease of someone who has never known a room that did not rearrange itself around his presence. He had survived 3 previous assassination attempts by the time of the wedding, a fact that the security arrangements for the day reflected and that the open carriage somewhat contradicted, but the contradiction was a deliberate one. The king who hid from his people in armored transport was not the king that Alfonso intended to be. The carriage had turned into the Calle Mayor and was moving through the densest section of the crowd when the bouquet of flowers landed on the wheel arch. It was not a bouquet of flowers. It was a bouquet of flowers wrapped around a bomb, thrown from a window several floors above the street level by a man named Mateo Moral, an anarchist with connections to the radical movements that had been destabilizing European governments and assassinating European monarchs with a regularity that the security services of the continent had proved consistently unable to prevent. Moral had obtained a position from which he could observe the processional route and had waited with the patience that the specific kind of political violence he had chosen requires. The explosion killed 23 people and wounded more than 100. The horses directly in front of the royal carriage were killed. The coachman was killed. The soldiers of the escort were killed, or wounded, in proportions that reflected their proximity to the point of detonation. The blood and the physical destruction were immediate and total, in the way that explosions in enclosed spaces among crowds of people are immediate and total, and the Calle Mayor, in the minutes after the detonation, was a scene that the people who witnessed it and survived it described, in the accounts they gave subsequently, in terms that resisted the ordinary vocabulary of horror, because the ordinary vocabulary was insufficient. The king and queen were not physically injured. This fact, which was established in the minutes after the explosion and which became the central element of the official account of the day, was received by the crowd with the particular quality of relief that crowds feel when catastrophe has been narrowly and visibly averted, a relief so intense that it expresses itself in ways that can look, from the outside, like celebration, when celebration is precisely the wrong word for what is happening. Ina's dress was covered in blood. The blood was from the people around her, from the soldiers, from the civilians, from the horses, and the image of the young queen in her wedding dress, soaked in the blood of people killed on her wedding day, is the image that has survived the longest from that morning. partly because it contains, in compressed visual form, the entire character of the experience, and partly because it was witnessed by enough people that its details have been preserved in multiple independent accounts. She did not scream. This is noted in the accounts of people present in the carriage and in the immediate vicinity, with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely remarkable, rather than the retrospective imposition of dignity onto a situation that required it. She was 19 years old and had never witnessed violent death, and the morning had just produced it in quantities that the most experienced soldier would have found overwhelming. And she did not scream, and she did not faint, and she did not do the things that the people around her might reasonably have expected her to do. Alfonso took her hand. The carriage continued. The royal couple arrived at the palace and entered it in the clothes they had been wearing on the Calle Mayor, Ana's dress carrying the evidence of the morning, in a form that no subsequent cleaning would entirely remove from the memory of everyone who had seen it. And the wedding reception proceeded, because the wedding reception was required to proceed, and because proceeding was the only available statement that the monarchy intended to make about what the morning had produced. The reception was not a celebration in any natural sense. It was a performance of celebration by people who were in shock, conducted with the formal precision that the occasion demanded, and that the people performing it understood was demanded regardless of what they were actually feeling. Ina moved through it with the composure that she had not been taught and had not consciously developed, but that the morning had apparently installed in her, the composure of someone who has understood, in a single morning, that the world she has entered is a world in which composure is not optional. The wedding night followed the reception. Whatever that night contained for two young people who had come closer to death than they had previously come, and who were still in the physical and emotional state that proximity to death produces, it has not been recorded in any source that has reached the public record. They were 20 and 19. They were strangers in the specific way that people are strangers when their courtship has been conducted across the formal distances that royal protocol maintains, and when the private knowledge that sustained intimacy requires has not yet been developed. What the night produced, in the most consequential sense, was a marriage. The marriage had been produced legally that morning on the Calle Mayor, but marriages in the full sense of the word are produced in the private negotiations that follow the public ceremony, and the negotiations that Ena and Alfonso entered in the weeks and months after the wedding took place, in a context that the bombing had colored in ways that neither of them could have anticipated when they agreed to the match. Alfonso's response to the bombing was publicly one of defiance. The king, who had ridden in an open carriage to his wedding, rode out again the following day. The king who had survived would continue to govern. The anarchists would not be permitted to demonstrate that their methods produced results. This response was genuine in its political dimension, and was also the response that a king in his position was required to produce, regardless of what he privately felt. What he privately felt about the morning has been described in accounts from people close to him at the time, in terms that go beyond the political response. He had been frightened, genuinely, viscerally frightened, in the way that 20-year-old men are frightened when the world explodes around them, regardless of how composed their public presentation of the experience manages to be. He had been frightened, and he had watched his wife not be frightened, or not visibly, and the watching had produced in him a complicated mixture of admiration and something less comfortable that the accounts of the period do not quite name, but that is present in the descriptions of his behavior in the weeks that followed. Ena's composure on the Calle Mayor became, in the retelling, one of the founding stories of her queenship, the British princess who had held herself together on her wedding day while the world fell apart around her. It was repeated at the Spanish court, by people who had witnessed it and by people who had heard about it from people who had witnessed it, and the repetition produced a version of Ina that was simultaneously admiring and slightly uncomfortable, admiring of the composure and slightly uncomfortable with the fact that a woman who had just arrived from England had demonstrated more of it than anyone around her. The Spanish court had expected to receive a young foreign woman who would require considerable management and who would gradually, over the years of her queenship, learn to meet the court's standards on the court's terms. The woman who had walked through the blood on the Calle Mayor without screaming was not that woman, and the court's adjustment to the reality of who Ena actually was began on her wedding day and was never quite completed. Morale was caught the following day and shot himself before he could be taken into custody. The investigation into how he had obtained his position on the route, who had known about the plan, and whether the security failures that allowed the bombing to proceed had been failures of competence or something more deliberate, produced the kind of official conclusions that investigations into failures of this kind tend to produce, conclusions that satisfied the institutional requirement for a finding without satisfying the historical requirement for a complete answer. The bomb had failed to kill the king and queen. The marriage it had failed to prevent had begun. The blood on the dress had been cleaned away, or had not been cleaned away, depending on which account of the dress's subsequent history you accept. Some sources suggest it was preserved, others that it was destroyed, and the uncertainty about something as concrete as a physical object tells you something about the broader uncertainty that surrounds the documentary record of Ina's life in Spain. She was queen. She was 19. She had survived her wedding day by a margin that the mathematics of bomb trajectories makes uncomfortably precise when you examine it. And the man she had married was already, in the weeks following the ceremony, displaying the specific quality of attention toward her that would define their marriage. An attention that was sometimes warm and sometimes cold, and that was always, beneath its surface variations, shaped by the question of what she was going to give him and whether it was going to be what he needed. The answer to that question arrived with the birth of their first son. The answer was not what he needed, and the manner of its arriving changed everything that followed in ways that the bomb, for all its violence, had not managed to change at all. Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, was born on the 10th of May 1907, 11 months after the wedding on the Calle Mayor. The birth was celebrated in the way that the birth of a male heir to a throne that had been without one for the entirety of the reigning king's life is celebrated, with the formal artillery salutes and the public announcements and the genuine relief of an institution that had been watching its young king survive assassination attempts for years and that understood, at some level it did not examine too directly, that a king without an heir is a dynasty's most vulnerable condition. The celebration lasted until the circumcision. The bleeding that followed the circumcision of the infant prince did not stop in the way that bleeding from a minor surgical procedure stops. It continued with the particular persistence that haemophilia produces, not the dramatic hemorrhage of catastrophic injury, but the slow, unstoppable seepage of blood from a wound whose clotting mechanism is absent. The bleeding, that continues after every visible cause for its continuation, has been addressed, that responds to no ordinary intervention with the ordinary result. The doctors were called. More doctors were called. The bleeding continued. The king was informed. What happened in the room where Alfonso received this information has not been recorded in any direct account. The people present for his reaction have described it in the careful language of people who understood that what they were witnessing was significant, and that significance required careful handling in its subsequent description. He was pale. He was silent for a period that the accounts describe as long without specifying its duration. He asked questions whose content has not been preserved, but whose direction is implicit in the answers he subsequently pursued. Questions about the source of the condition, about its inheritance, about which side of the child's parentage had introduced it into the blood of the heir to the Spanish throne. The answers to these questions were available, in the form that the medical knowledge of 1907 could provide them. Haemophilia was understood, by 1907, to be a condition that passed through the female line, that women carried it without suffering its effects, and that their sons had a 50% chance of inheriting the active condition. The carrier status of Ena's family was not a secret in the sense of being unknown to medical science. Queen Victoria's haemophiliac descendants had been documented across the European royal families with enough regularity that the pattern was visible to anyone who was looking for it. The question of whether anyone had looked for it before the marriage was arranged is the question that the subsequent history of Ena's marriage requires to be asked, and that the subsequent accounts of the period have generally not asked with sufficient directness. The Battenberg family's connection to Victoria's haemophilia gene was not established fact in 1906. Ina's brother Leopold would not develop haemophilia until later, providing the direct evidence of the gene's presence in that branch of the family that would retrospectively clarify what the pre-marriage picture had left ambiguous. But the general association between Victoria's descendants and the haemophilia that had appeared in several of her children and grandchildren was available information in 1906, and the question of whether that information was sought, found, and assessed before the Spanish king married a Battenberg princess is one that the historical record has never satisfactorily answered. Alfonso's position, in the days and weeks following the circumcision, was that Enna had brought haemophilia into the Spanish royal line, and that the bringing of it was a wrong done to him and to Spain, that the circumstances of its doing did not adequately excuse. This position was stated, in terms that varied in their explicitness depending on the audience, across the years that followed, and it became the emotional foundation of a marriage that continued for 2 decades in the institutional sense while dissolving in the personal sense from the moment it was established. He did not divorce her. Divorce was not available to a Catholic king of Spain in 1907 in any practical sense, and the political consequences of attempting it would have been sufficiently severe that the attempt was not seriously contemplated. He also did not create the physical separation that would have made the emotional separation formal. He stayed in the marriage, in the specific way that people stay in situations that they cannot exit and cannot accept, which is to say badly, with the sustained damage to everyone around them that irresolvable resentment always produces. Ina stayed too. She stayed with the particular combination of dignity and damage that characterizes the position of a woman who has been blamed for something she did not do, and who has nowhere to go, even if she were prepared to concede the blame, which she was not. She had left England. She had converted. She had produced an heir, which was what the marriage had required of her. That the heir carried a genetic condition she had not known she was carrying was a fact she had not manufactured and could not change, and the refusal of the man who blamed her for it to acknowledge these elementary truths was a refusal that she encountered every day for the remainder of their life together. The Spanish court took its position from the king, as courts always do when the king's position is clearly held and publicly expressed. The foreign queen who had brought bad blood into the dynasty became, in the social atmosphere of the Madrid court, the subject of a sustained coldness that stopped well short of formal exclusion. She was queen, and the forms of queenship were observed, but that made the substance of her daily existence inside the court considerably colder than the forms suggested. The ladies of the court who served her were ladies performing a duty rather than ladies expressing a preference. The grandees, who attended the formal occasions at which the queen was required to be present, were grandees fulfilling a function rather than grandees offering their genuine loyalty. The warmth that a court extends to a queen it has accepted was not extended to Ina because the court had not accepted her, had accepted her formally in the way that formal acceptance is performed, while withholding the informal acceptance that is the substance of what the performance is supposed to represent. She bore a second son, Jaime, in 1908. Jaime was not haemophiliac, but he was profoundly deaf, following a mastoid operation in childhood, which meant that the second son was also, for the practical purposes of dynastic succession, a problematic heir. The pattern that was developing, the queen who produced children who could not fulfill the function that the dynasty needed them to fulfill, was not one that the medical facts supported as Ina's fault, but it was a pattern that the court's narrative about her had no difficulty incorporating into the existing framework of blame. She bore 4 more children across the years that followed, 2 daughters and 2 more sons. The sons, Alfonso and Gonzalo, were both haemophiliac. The daughters, Beatrice and Maria Cristina, were carriers, carrying the gene without suffering its effects, in the way that their mother had carried it, and that female carriers, in the Victorian inheritance, always carried it. The family that Ina and Alfonso produced was therefore a family that haemophilia ran through completely, not universally expressed, but universally present, shaping every child's life in ways that ranged from the direct physical danger of the haemophiliac sons to the subtler genetic burden of the carrier daughters. Alfonso's response to each haemophiliac birth was the response that his initial reaction had established as the pattern, a withdrawal, a renewed expression of the blame that the first birth had produced, a deepening of the emotional distance between himself and the wife he held responsible for what the births contained. The withdrawals were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were atmospheric rather than behavioral, a quality of absence in his presence, a coldness in interactions that had previously carried warmth, the specific kind of emotional unavailability that people produce when they have decided, at some level beneath the decisions they make consciously, that the person in front of them is responsible for their suffering. He had affairs. This is stated in all the serious accounts of Alfonso's reign with varying degrees of emphasis. And the emphasis varies because the affairs themselves varied. Some were brief and relatively discreet. Others were sustained and publicly known in the way that royal affairs become publicly known when the court has decided that discretion serves the court's interests less than the alternative. The affairs were the expression, in the most visible form available, of a marriage whose internal reality had separated from its external form, and they were conducted with the particular flagrance of a man who has concluded that the person he is married to has forfeited the claim on his fidelity that the marriage would otherwise have sustained. Ina knew about the affairs. Courts are not environments in which information of this kind remains private, and Ina had been in the court long enough by the time the affairs became a pattern to have developed the sources and the social intelligence to know what was happening. She did not make public scenes. She did not issue ultimatums that she lacked the power to enforce. She managed the knowledge of the affairs with the same composure she had brought to the Calle Mayor, not because she was indifferent to them, but because the alternatives to composure were alternatives that the situation did not support. The management of the hemophiliac son's medical needs fell primarily to her. The Spanish court of the early 20th century had excellent physicians and limited understanding of hemophilia's management, which meant that the care of Alfonso and Gonzalo was a daily exercise in the management of a condition whose mechanisms were understood better than its treatment. Every fall, every bruise, every minor injury that would have been inconsequential in a healthy child became, in the hemophiliac princes, a potential crisis that required immediate medical attention and sustained nursing care. Ina provided that care with a completeness that the accounts of people who observed her with her sons describe as genuine rather than performed. She was not playing the role of devoted mother for a court that had already decided she was the wrong kind of mother. She was simply there for her sons in the way that the specific demands of their condition required, with the sustained practical attention that hemophilia's management demands from the people closest to its sufferers. The king visited the sick rooms when the crises were severe. His visits were brief and were colored by the particular quality of distress that a man experiences when the suffering of his child is something he has, in his own emotional accounting, attributed to his wife's genetic inheritance. He loved his sons. The love was real and was visible in the accounts of people present for his interactions with them. The love coexisted with the blame he directed at their mother, and the coexistence of those two things produced in him, across the years of the marriage, a sustained internal contradiction that he resolved by directing its costs outward rather than absorbing them inward. The costs landed on Ina. They landed daily, in the forms that sustained blame always takes in a marriage from which neither party can exit. In the atmospheres, the silences, the small social signals that communicate contempt without requiring its expression. In the public behavior that told the court and the world that the king's wife was a queen he endured rather than a woman he respected. She endured it. The endurance was not passive, it was the active, daily, chosen endurance of a woman who had decided that the alternative to endurance was a surrender that the situation did not merit and that she was not prepared to make. The marriage continued, the sons bled, the court watched. And Enna, Queen of Spain, by a conversion and a wedding and a bomb that had not quite managed to kill her on her wedding day, held herself inside a situation that the man who had chosen her had decided she deserved, with a steadiness that the situation's architects had not anticipated and never quite managed to break. The Spanish court of the early 20th century was not a court that made foreigners comfortable. This was not a policy, not a conscious decision made by any individual or group of individuals with the explicit intention of making the foreign queen feel unwelcome. It was simply the natural product of an institution that had been Spanish in its culture, its language, its social codes, and its assumptions about the world for long enough that the presence of someone who had been formed by an entirely different set of codes registered as a permanent, low-level disruption to the institution's sense of itself. Enna was English. She had converted to Catholicism, and she had learned Spanish, and she had done both with sufficient completeness that neither the conversion nor the language was a daily practical obstacle. But conversion and language acquisition are not the same thing as belonging, and belonging is what the Spanish court required of its queen in ways that conversion and language acquisition could not supply. Belonging required the specific cultural formation that comes from having grown up inside a set of assumptions about how rooms are entered, how conversations are structured, how deference is expressed and authority communicated, how the specific social grammar of a particular aristocratic culture is deployed in the 1,000 daily interactions that constitute life inside a royal court. And Enna had grown up inside a different set of assumptions entirely. The differences were not large in any individual instance. They accumulated into something substantial across the daily life of a woman who was required to perform queenship in a cultural register that was not her native one, who was watched by an audience expert in identifying the deviations from the register that the performance was supposed to embody, and who knew that the watching was not the neutral observation of people willing to be impressed, but the critical attention of people whose verdict had been shaped in advance by the king's attitude toward his wife. Alfonso's position on Enna, the blame, the withdrawal, the affairs conducted with insufficient discretion, communicated itself to the court with the efficiency that the king's position on anything communicated itself to the people around him. Courts are environments in which the sovereign's emotional register shapes the institution's social atmosphere with a directness that has no equivalent in civilian life, where the boss's feelings about an employee can be managed and contained by institutional structures that prevent them from becoming the entire texture of the workplace. In a royal court, there are no such structures. The king's feeling about the queen is the court's feeling about the queen, not because the court is instructed to adopt it, but because the court understands, with the social intelligence that survival in such environments requires, that the king's feeling is the safest available guide to how the court should position itself. The grandes dames of the Madrid court, the women of the old aristocratic families, whose bloodlines and whose relationships to the institution stretched back generations, and whose social authority within the court derived from that continuity, positioned themselves accordingly. They were not rude to Enna. Rudeness to the queen was a category of behavior that even the most hostile court member understood was unavailable to them, without consequences that the hostility was not worth. They were correct. They were formally attentive. They performed the obligations of their position toward the queen with the precision of people who have learned that performance and substance can be separated without the separation being visible in any individual act, only in the accumulated texture of all the acts together. The accumulated texture was cold. Enna felt it and described it in the letters she wrote to her mother and to the few people in England with whom she maintained the correspondence that sustained her connection to the world she had left, in terms that are specific enough to be taken as direct observation rather than general complaint. She described the quality of attention she received at court gatherings, present, formally correct, and somehow absent in a way she found difficult to name precisely. She described the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms and resumed in a different register when she was present, the shift in atmosphere that her arrival produced in spaces where the court was conducting itself in the way it conducted itself when the queen was not watching. She was always watching. This was one of the things about her that the court found most unsettling, and that the accounts of people who observed her during this period most consistently note: her capacity for observation, for reading the social signals of the environment she was in, with an accuracy that the people producing those signals had not anticipated from a woman they had categorized as decorative and foreign, and therefore relatively easy to manage. She saw what was happening around her, she understood it, and her understanding was visible enough in the quality of her attention that the people she was observing understood that they were being observed clearly. This quality made the court uncomfortable in a way that simple incompetence or obvious distress would not have made it uncomfortable. A queen who was struggling, who was visibly failing to meet the court's standards, who was clearly out of her depth in the environment she had been placed in. Such a queen confirms the court's assessment of her and requires nothing further from the court than the confirmation. A queen who sees clearly what is being done to her and meets it with composure rather than collapse is a queen who requires the court to maintain its position against the evidence of her dignity, which is a more effortful posture and one that produces, over time, a specific kind of institutional discomfort. The aristocratic Spanish women, who formed the core of Ena's social world at court, were women of considerable sophistication. They were not unsympathetic to women who suffered. They had their own experiences of the specific constraints that women of their class and period navigated, and those experiences gave them a capacity for recognition, if not always for solidarity. What prevented solidarity, in Ena's case, was precisely the thing that might have produced it: the genetic question. The court had absorbed Alfonso's position on the haemophilia, and the absorption had made the sympathy that Ena's situation might otherwise have generated unavailable, because sympathy for the woman who had brought bad blood into the dynasty required a rejection of the king's position that the court was not prepared to make. The religious dimension of court life added another layer to Ena's isolation. She had converted, and her conversion was genuine, in the sense that she had committed to it with the seriousness that the commitment required, and had practiced it with the regularity that a queen whose religious observance was publicly visible was required to maintain. But conversion is not the same as formation, and the specifically Spanish Catholicism of the early 20th century court, its particular devotional culture, its specific saints, and its specific liturgical traditions, its relationship to the church as a social institution as much as a spiritual one, was a formation that Ena had not received and could not quite replicate even when she was performing it correctly. The women who had grown up inside that formation recognized the absence of it in her, not because any individual act of devotion was incorrect, but because the quality of the devotion was different, consciously performed rather than absorbed, chosen rather than inherited, and therefore carrying the specific quality that chosen things carry when they exist alongside people for whom the same thing was never a choice, but simply the air they breathed. Her English ladies-in-waiting, the women she had brought from Britain to provide a connection to the world she had left, were a source of comfort and also a source of difficulty. Their presence was a comfort because they were people with whom she could be herself in the fullest sense, could speak English without translation, could reference the world she had grown up in without explanation, could relax the performance of Spanishness that the court required of her. Their presence was a difficulty because the court interpreted the maintenance of English ladies as evidence that Ena had not fully committed to Spain, had kept one foot in the country she had come from as an insurance against the country she had come to, and the interpretation fed the narrative of the foreign queen who had never truly arrived. The truth was more complicated. The English ladies were not a retreat from Spain but a resource, the resource that people who have moved between cultures always require, a connection to the formation that shaped them, that allows the performance of a different formation to continue, without the performer losing themselves entirely in the performance. Ena was performing Spanishness every day, in every public context, and the English ladies were the space in which she did not have to, and the space was not a retreat from her queenship, but the condition that made sustaining it possible. Alfonso's attitude toward the English ladies was consistent with his attitude toward everything about Ena that reminded him of what she had brought from England. He tolerated their presence because removing them entirely would have produced a diplomatic consequence he did not want, and a queen who was even more isolated than she already was, and an isolated queen was a queen who could not perform the public functions of her role adequately. He did not welcome their presence, and the not welcoming communicated itself to them, and through them to Ena, with the efficiency that the king's feelings communicated themselves to everything around him. She had friends, within these constraints. The constraints themselves determined the character of the friendships. They were friendships conducted in the margins of the court's social world, with people who had sufficient independence from the court's dominant attitudes to maintain a connection to her that the dominant attitudes would have prevented. Some were members of the aristocracy, whose personal assessment of Ena had formed independently of the court's collective position. Some were people from the diplomatic world, whose connection to the court was functional rather than social, and who therefore had less to lose from a genuine friendship with the Queen than the court's own members did. These friendships were real, and they mattered to Enna, and their mattering is documented in the letters and the accounts that have survived. But they were not the friendships of a woman who had found her place in the world she had chosen. They were the friendships of a woman who had found the best available substitute for a place that the world she had chosen was not going to provide, and the distinction between those two things colored everything about her experience of Spain across the 25 years of her reign. She was queen of a country that had never quite decided to receive her. She was married to a man who had decided, on the basis of a genetic fact that she had not manufactured, that she had failed him. She was mother to children whose medical needs required from her a daily engagement with suffering that the man who shared responsibility for those children had directed at her rather than absorbed with her. She managed all of it. The management was visible in the public record as composure, and it was taken by the court as evidence of coldness, and it was neither of those things. It was the daily achievement of a woman who had understood, somewhere in the years following the wedding and the bomb and the circumcision that had revealed the haemophilia, that the only available response to her situation was to be, within it, completely and uncompromisingly herself. The court never understood this. It interpreted her steadiness as distance, her composure as arrogance, her refusal to collapse as the absence of feeling rather than the presence of will. It was wrong about all of it. The wrongness did not diminish its effects. Alfonso XIII was not a man who conducted his personal life with discretion. This is established across enough independent sources: the memoirs of court members, the diplomatic dispatches of foreign ambassadors, the accounts of journalists who covered the Spanish court during the first 3 decades of the 20th century, that its general character is beyond serious dispute. He had relationships with women who were not his wife, and he had them with a regularity and a visibility that made the relationships something the court did not simply know about, but actively managed around, incorporating them into the social landscape of the Madrid court, the way that courts have always incorporated the inconvenient personal lives of the monarchs they serve, by acknowledging them informally, while maintaining the formal structure, as though the informal reality did not exist. The women varied in their backgrounds and in the nature of their connections to the king. Some were women of the aristocracy, whose families' relationship to the court gave them access to Alfonso in social contexts that proximity sometimes transforms into something more personal. Some were women from outside the aristocratic world entirely: actresses, socialites, women whose connection to Alfonso's world was personal rather than institutional, and whose involvement with him therefore carried different social risks and different social freedoms than involvement with a court insider would have carried. The most significant of the relationships, significant in the sense of being sustained and publicly known and producing consequences that went beyond the personal, was his connection to Carmen Ruiz Moragas, an actress whose relationship with Alfonso lasted for years and produced 2 children that Alfonso acknowledged. The acknowledgement was not a formal royal acknowledgement in any institutional sense. The children were not given royal titles or official positions within the dynasty's structure. But the acknowledgement was real and was known, and its being known made it something that Enna was required to navigate in the specific way that the wives of powerful men have always been required to navigate the public acknowledgement of their husbands' other families, with the appearance of ignorance or the performance of indifference, since any other response would have made her situation worse rather than better. She chose the performance of indifference, which was not the same thing as indifference, and which required from her a daily discipline that the people observing it consistently misread as coldness. The Spanish court, which had decided that Enna was a cold woman and was therefore looking for evidence of coldness in everything she produced, found in her management of the affair's public dimension exactly the evidence it was looking for: a woman who did not react to her husband's infidelities as a warm woman would react, which confirmed that she was not a warm woman, which confirmed the court's original assessment. The circularity of this reasoning was invisible to the people employing it, as the circularity of institutional reasoning generally is invisible to the institution that produces it. The court needed Enna to be the kind of woman who deserved what was happening to her, and her responses to what was happening to her were interpreted through that need rather than assessed on their own terms. The humiliations were not only the affairs. The affairs were the most visible dimension of a pattern of behavior that expressed itself in smaller ways, daily, and in larger ways periodically, and the smaller daily ways were in some respects harder to manage than the larger periodic ones, because they accumulated without any single instance being sufficient to constitute a formal grievance. Alfonso spoke about Enna in company in terms that the accounts of people present for those conversations describe as dismissive. Not cruelly dismissive, not the open contempt of a man who has decided to be brutal about his wife in public, but the casually reductive dismissiveness of a man who has concluded that his wife is not someone whose perspective or intelligence merits serious engagement. He would make remarks, in the gatherings of men that the Spanish court of the period produced, and that Enna was not present for, about her English qualities, her English reserve, her English manner of approaching things, the English formation that had produced in her a woman who was not quite Spanish enough for Spain and not quite warm enough for him. These remarks were reported back to Enna, because remarks of this kind always are reported back, because courts are environments where information moves through channels that the people who generate the information do not always account for, and because some of the people who heard the remarks were people who were genuinely fond of Enna and who understood that she was owed the knowledge of what was being said about her in her absence. She received the reports with the composure that she brought to everything, which is to say, she received them and processed them privately and presented no visible evidence of having received them in any subsequent public context. The processing was not simple and was not quick and was not without cost. She was a woman of genuine pride, the specific pride that comes from having chosen to leave everything familiar and to make something of yourself in an entirely new world, and the knowledge that the man who had asked her to make that choice was describing her to his court as inadequate was a daily source of pain that the composure managed but did not eliminate. The diplomatic dimension of the humiliations added a public layer to their private character. Foreign ambassadors to the Spanish court were people who observed the royal household with professional attention and who reported what they observed through the diplomatic channels that their governments maintained. The dispatches from the British ambassador during the middle years of Alfonso's reign contain observations about the Queen's position at court that are characteristically diplomatic in their language and characteristically clear in their implication. A queen who was not well treated, whose standing with her husband was poor, whose isolation within the court was visible to professional observers from the outside. These dispatches were read in London by people who understood that the Queen of Spain was a British princess and that her treatment by her husband and his court was therefore a matter with a diplomatic dimension that went beyond the purely personal. The response of the British royal family and the British government to what the dispatches described was the response that institutions typically produce when the information they receive is uncomfortable and the options available to address it are limited. A policy of non-intervention dressed in the language of respect for the Queen's autonomy and her chosen life. Enna's mother Beatrice received her daughter's letters with the particular anguish of a woman who understood from the letters' subtext, if not always from their explicit content, that her daughter was suffering in ways that the letters were designed to minimize. Beatrice was not a woman with resources of her own, sufficient to change Enna's situation. She was a widow of moderate means living in the margins of the British royal family, without the political influence or the personal authority that would have allowed her to advocate effectively for a daughter whose position was determined by the choices of a foreign king over whom she had no leverage. She wrote back. The correspondence between Enna and her mother across the years of the reign is one of the documentary resources that historians of the period have found most valuable, partly because it provides access to Enna's private state in a form that the official record never provides, and partly because the specific things that Enna chose to tell her mother and the specific things she chose not to tell her are both informative, the told things illuminating what she experienced, and the untold things illuminating what she experienced, and the untold things the untold things were, by most assessments of people who have read the correspondence carefully, the more painful things. The letters contain the suffering that Ina felt she could share without destroying her mother's peace of mind. The suffering she could not share, the specific humiliations, the particular cruelties, the daily texture of life inside a marriage whose terms had been set by a blame she had not deserved and could not discharge, stayed in the privacy that the letters were designed to protect. The children were the dimension of the marriage that produced both its most acute suffering and its most genuine connection between Ina and Alfonso. The haemophiliac sons, Alfonso and Gonzalo, required a level of medical attention and parental anxiety that created, in the spaces around the crises they produced, a shared experience that the marriage's other conditions could not quite eliminate. Alfonso loved his sons. Ina loved her sons. The love they each bore for the same children produced occasions on which the blame and the coldness and the affairs were temporarily suspended in the shared experience of watching a child bleed and waiting for the bleeding to stop. The temporary suspensions were not reconciliations. They did not produce the conversations that might have led to reconciliation. They produced a proximity that the rest of the marriage made impossible to sustain, and that dissolved, when the crisis was over, back into the established conditions of distance and blame. But they were real, and they mattered to Ina, because they were the evidence that the man she had married was capable of something other than the posture he maintained toward her, and the evidence kept alive a hope that the rest of her experience of the marriage consistently undermined. She had married him. She had converted and crossed the channel, and produced his children, and managed his court, and endured his affairs, and absorbed his blame, and she had done all of it without the public complaint that would have damaged the institution she had committed to serving. The commitment was not simple loyalty to an institution that had treated her badly. It was more complicated than loyalty, more specifically personal. She had chosen Spain, and she had chosen Alfonso, and she had chosen to stay, and the choosing had produced a life that was not what she had expected, and that she was not prepared to repudiate by leaving it. She stayed, because leaving would have required her to concede that the choice had been wrong. Conceding that the choice had been wrong would have required her to become, in her own self-understanding, the person that Alfonso's blame had always wanted to make her, the woman who had failed Spain, who had failed the dynasty, who had brought bad blood and foreign coldness into a court that had deserved better. She was not that woman. She stayed to prove it. The staying was the proof. The proof was not acknowledged by the people who most needed to acknowledge it. It rarely is. The Spanish monarchy that Ina had married into in 1906 was not the stable institution that the wedding celebrations had suggested. It was a monarchy operating inside a political system that had been lurching between crisis and managed stability for decades, a constitutional monarchy whose constitution was observed selectively, whose parliamentary system functioned through the organized manipulation of electoral results, that the Spanish political class had developed into something approaching an art form, and whose relationship with the military, the church, and the regional nationalist movements that were reshaping the country's political landscape was contested in ways that no amount of royal ceremonial could resolve. Alfonso governed in the way that kings govern, when the constitutional framework around them is simultaneously real and porous, working within it when it served his purposes, and around it when it did not, with the particular confidence of a man who had been king since birth, and who had developed, through the decades of his reign, a conception of his own authority that the Constitution's framers had not entirely anticipated, and that the politicians who worked within the system found alternately useful and alarming. Ina's role in this political landscape was not formally defined. Queen's consort, in constitutional monarchies of the early 20th century, occupied a position whose political dimension was understood to be minimal and whose public function was understood to be ceremonial, the presentation of the royal family to the public, in terms that humanized the institution without complicating its political relationships. She was expected to appear at the occasions that required her appearance, to perform the charitable and social functions that the monarchy's public image required, and to remain sufficiently removed from the political decisions that the government and the king made together that her removal could be taken as confirmation of her proper constitutional position. She observed this expectation with the intelligence of someone who understood both its formal requirements and its informal limits. She did not attend cabinet meetings. She did not conduct independent diplomacy with foreign governments. She did not issue public statements about the political questions that the Spanish press was debating with an intensity that the country's instability produced and sustained. She performed the role that the role required, and she performed it with the competence that the court, despite its general hostility toward her, was never able to deny. But she was not politically inert. She could not have been politically inert even if she had chosen to be, because the position of queen consort in an unstable monarchy places the person who holds it at the intersection of currents that political inertness cannot navigate. But she observed the men who came to Alfonso with their proposals and their requests and their versions of the country's political reality, and she formed assessments of those men that her years of court life had given her the tools to form accurately. She understood which advisers were serving the king's genuine interests and which were serving their own. She understood which political directions were sustainable and which were not, and she held those understandings with the discipline of someone who knew that expressing them openly would produce consequences that would damage both her position and her influence. The influence she exercised was informal, conducted through the channels that informal influence always uses, through the quality of attention she paid to the right conversations, through the things she said and did not say, in the private moments that married life produces even inside a marriage as damaged as hers, through the people she cultivated and the people she maintained distance from, and the distinctions she drew between those two categories based on assessments that were consistently more accurate than the court gave her credit for. The Moroccan question dominated Spanish politics for much of the middle period of Alfonso's reign, producing the military disasters and the political recriminations that culminated in the annual disaster of 1921, when Spanish forces were overwhelmed by Berber fighters and approximately 12,000 soldiers were killed. The disaster produced a political crisis of sufficient severity that it threatened the monarchy's stability in ways that the previous crises of the reign had not, generating investigations and accusations that pointed toward the king's personal role in the military decisions that had produced the catastrophe. Enna observed this crisis from close range. She was not a participant in the military and political decisions that had preceded it, but she was present in the court during the years when those decisions were made, and she had observed, with the attention she brought to everything, the processes through which Alfonso's relationship with his military advisers had produced the conditions for the disaster. Her private assessments of the key figures, the generals, the politicians, the advisers who had shaped the Moroccan policy, have been preserved in fragments in the correspondence of the period, and the fragments are notable for their accuracy. She had understood, before the disaster made it publicly obvious, that the military policy in Morocco was being conducted on the basis of assumptions that the situation on the ground did not support, and that the men advising Alfonso on those assumptions were men whose investment in their own assessments was preventing them from revising those assessments in response to evidence that should have required revision. She had not said this publicly. She had said it, in careful terms, in private, to the people she trusted enough to say it to, and the saying of it had produced no change in the policy that the saying had identified as problematic. This is the specific frustration of informal influence in a political system that does not formally acknowledge it. Enna could see clearly. She could not act on what she saw, except through channels whose indirectness made them inadequate to the scale of what the clarity required. The disaster happened because the people with the formal authority to prevent it chose not to use that authority in the way that the situation required, and Enna's informal understanding of the situation's requirements had no mechanism for becoming the formal direction that might have changed the outcome. The Primo de Rivera dictatorship, which began in 1923 when General Miguel Primo de Rivera staged the coup that suspended the Spanish constitution and established a military directorate with Alfonso's acquiescence, placed Enna's position in the political landscape in a new configuration. Alfonso's support for the coup, or at minimum his failure to oppose it, was a political decision with constitutional implications that the king's subsequent attempts to manage his relationship with both the dictatorship and the constitutional politicians who opposed it never fully resolved. Ina's response to the coup has been described in the accounts of people close to her during this period in terms that suggest a private position more critical of Alfonso's choice than any public statement she made would have indicated. She understood constitutionalism, had grown up in the most successful constitutional monarchy in Europe, and had been formed by its assumptions about the relationship between the crown and the democratic institutions that the crown was supposed to sustain rather than override. The Spanish constitution was an imperfect instrument, but it was the instrument, and Alfonso's acquiescence in its suspension was an act whose long-term consequences she understood more clearly than the king's immediate political calculations allowed him to understand them. She said nothing publicly. Saying something publicly would have produced a constitutional crisis of a different kind. A queen publicly at odds with her husband's political direction was a category of royal conduct that no constitutional framework of the period had any mechanism for accommodating. She absorbed the political discomfort of Alfonso's choice and continued performing the functions of queenship that the dictatorship's social and ceremonial requirements placed upon her, with the discipline of someone who had long since learned to separate the performance of her role from the private reality of her assessments. Her charitable work during this period took on a political dimension that it had not carried in the earlier years of the reign, because charity in a country under a military dictatorship is not the politically neutral activity that it appears in more stable political environments. The causes she supported, the institutions she visited, the specific populations she directed her charitable attention toward, these choices were made in a political landscape where every choice carried a meaning that went beyond the charitable intention, and Ina made them with an awareness of that landscape that the official account of her charitable activities has generally not acknowledged. She was particularly active in the development of medical infrastructure, hospitals, nursing training, the organization of public health responses to the epidemics that periodically swept through the Spanish population during this period. This activity had an obvious personal dimension. The mother of hemophiliac sons, who had spent years managing the medical crises that hemophilia produced, had a more intimate understanding than most queens of what adequate medical infrastructure meant for the people who needed it. But the activity also had a political dimension, because investment in public health in a country where the political class had consistently underinvested in it was itself a statement about priorities that the official political direction did not share.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
Alfonso tolerated the charitable work because it served the monarchy's public image in ways that the political situation made the public image particularly necessary to maintain. He did not engage with it as the expression of a political perspective that his wife had formed independently, because engaging with it in those terms would have required him to acknowledge that she had a political perspective that was independently formed and worth engaging with, and acknowledging this was not a concession he was prepared to make. She had a perspective. It was consistently more accurate than the perspectives of the men who held the formal authority to act on their perspectives. The consistency of its accuracy and the consistency of its formal irrelevance to the decisions that were made around her is the political story of Ena's reign, a story whose telling requires the acknowledgement that the institution she served was organized in ways it did not examine and had no interest in changing, to prevent the most perceptive person in its vicinity from having any formal mechanism for applying that perception to the decisions that shaped the world she lived in. The world she lived in was moving, through the years of the dictatorship and its eventual collapse, toward a political crisis that would resolve itself in the only way that crises of that depth and duration resolve: through the dissolution of the structure that had contained them, and the beginning of something whose character nobody in the court of Alfonso XIII in the early 1930s was fully equipped to anticipate. Ena had been watching the dissolution develop for years. She had watched it with the clarity that her position gave her and the frustration that her position imposed on her, and she had understood what was coming with an accuracy that the events of 1931 would confirm. She was not surprised when the monarchy fell. She had seen it falling for a long time. The Spanish municipal elections of April 1931 were not supposed to determine the fate of the monarchy. They were local elections, mayors and town councillors, the administrative infrastructure of Spanish civic life rather than its constitutional foundations, and the decision to hold them had been made by the political class as a way of testing the public mood after the Primo de Rivera dictatorship's collapse the previous year, without putting the monarchy itself directly to the question that everyone in Spanish political life understood was the real question. The results answered the real question anyway. The Republican parties won decisively in the major cities, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, the urban centers whose electoral results carried the symbolic weight that rural results, however numerous, could not match in the political imagination of a country that was urbanizing rapidly, and that was doing so with a speed that its political institutions had not kept pace with. The Republicans read the results as a mandate for the Republic. The monarchists read them as a warning that the monarchy could not survive another election without a more substantial base of support than the municipal results had revealed. Alfonso read them as something he had been reading the political landscape for years without adequately acting on, evidence that the ground beneath the monarchy had shifted further than any of the adjustments he had made to his political positioning had managed to address. He decided to leave. The decision was made with a speed that surprised some of the people around him, and that has been interpreted, across the subsequent decades, in ways that reflect the interpreter's prior position on Alfonso more than they reflect the evidence of the decision itself. His defenders have described it as a sacrifice, the king removing himself from Spain to prevent the violence that a contested abdication might have produced, placing the country's stability above his own position, with a selflessness that the Republic's subsequent history should have vindicated. His critics have described it as flight. A king abandoning his throne when holding it required the kind of sustained political courage that the evidence of his reign suggested he did not consistently possess. The truth contains elements of both descriptions without being fully captured by either. Alfonso was not a coward. His personal physical courage had been demonstrated across the assassination attempts of his reign, with a consistency that made the charge of physical cowardice impossible to sustain. But political courage and physical courage are different things, and the political courage required to remain in Spain in April 1931 and contest the Republic's formation through legitimate means was a courage that the specific character of his political options made genuinely difficult to assess from the outside. He left on the 14th of April 1931. He did not formally abdicate, a distinction he maintained for the remainder of his life and that his supporters maintained after his death, on the grounds that a king who does not abdicate remains king in the constitutional sense, regardless of the political reality that surrounds him. He simply left, by car to the coast and then by ship to Marseille, with the specific quality of departure that people produce when they are leaving something they have not decided to leave permanently, but whose return they cannot currently guarantee. Ina was not with him. This detail, the king's departure without the queen, the exile that began as a separation and then became something more formal, is the detail that the accounts of April 1931 most consistently note and most consistently fail to examine with sufficient attention. She was in England when the elections produced their result, visiting family and friends in the way that she periodically visited England across the years of the reign. The visit, by the accounts of people who saw her during it, was not a planned departure. She had not gone to England in anticipation of not returning. She had gone because she had connections there that the years of isolation in Madrid had made her value more rather than less, and the timing of her visit and the timing of the monarchy's collapse were the coincidence that history sometimes produces and that people who prefer patterns to coincidences have difficulty accepting as such. The coincidence was also, at another level, not entirely coincidental. Ina had been watching the monarchy's trajectory for years with an accuracy that suggested she understood what direction it was moving in, and visiting England at a moment of political uncertainty in Spain was the kind of decision that someone with her understanding of the situation might make with less than fully conscious intentionality. Not a planned escape, but a departure shaped by an instinct that the situation was approaching a point at which being elsewhere was the wiser option. She did not return to Spain as queen. The republic that replaced the monarchy did not extend to the former royal family the invitation to return that would have been required for a return to be possible, and the political conditions of the Republic's early years made any such invitation inconceivable. Ena's Spanish life, the 25 years of queenship, the court that had never accepted her, the marriage that had defined her adult existence through its sustained difficulty as much as through its formal structure, ended with the finality of a political transformation that left no room for the personal negotiations through which endings are usually managed. She and Alfonso were in exile together, in the technical sense that they occupied the same category of persons removed from Spain by the Republic's existence. They were not together in any fuller sense. The marriage that had been dissolving since the circumcision of their first son had no mechanism, in exile, for the formal structures that had sustained its external appearance across the years of the reign. In Spain, the queen was required to appear with the king because the institution required the appearance. In exile, there was no institution making requirements, and the appearance dissolved without the institution that had necessitated it. Alfonso moved between European capitals, Paris, Rome, London, with the restless quality of a man who had been a king and who found the absence of the role impossible to accommodate with the static domestic life that most exiles eventually settle into. He was still king, in his own understanding and in the understanding of the Spanish monarchist movement that continued to regard him as the legitimate sovereign. The question of restoration, of the conditions under which he might return to Spain, of the political alignments that might make restoration possible, occupied him with an energy that the practical obstacles to it consistently failed to diminish. Ina found a different accommodation with exile. She settled in England, in the country she had left at 19, and to which she returned at 43, in the specific condition of a woman who has spent 25 years building something that has been dismantled around her. The England she returned to was not the England she had left. It was a different country in its post-war character, its political culture, its social landscape, and she was a different woman in ways that the England she had left could not have predicted from the girl who had converted and sailed for Spain in 1906. She had a family in England. Her mother was still alive. Beatrice would survive until 1944, and the reunion with her daughter after the exile's beginning was one of the few unambiguously good things that the exile's circumstances produced. She had cousins and connections and the extended royal family network that Victoria's descendants maintained across the European houses, and the network provided a social world that was genuine rather than performed in the way that the Madrid court had always been performed. The marriage ended formally in 1934, when Alfonso and Ina separated, in the legal sense that separation without divorce was possible for a Catholic king and queen who remained technically married while living entirely separate lives. The separation document, the formal acknowledgement that the marriage had reached the point at which its continuation in any form other than the legal required a formal renegotiation of its terms, was a document that both parties signed without the drama that the marriage's history might have suggested the signing would produce. There was no drama because there was nothing left to dramatize. The marriage had been ending since 1907. The formal separation was the acknowledgement of a conclusion that the preceding 27 years had been reaching without quite arriving at, and the arrival, when it came, had the quality of the completion of something that had been underway for long enough that its completion was relief rather than rupture. Alfonso went to Rome, where he died in February 1941, in a hotel room, of the heart condition that had been developing for years and that the exile's conditions had not improved. He died still calling himself King of Spain, still maintaining the position that his departure in 1931 had been a suspension rather than an abdication, still sustaining the monarchist cause that his son Juan would carry forward after his death with the patience that the Franco years required. Ena was in England when Alfonso died. She was 53 years old. She had been Queen of Spain for 25 years and had been in exile for 10. The man who had blamed her for the haemophilia, who had conducted his affairs with visible flagrance, who had spoken of her in dismissive terms in the company of men who reported it back to her, who had left Spain without her in April 1931 and had not arranged for any reunion that the exile's geography made impossible. That man was dead, and whatever she felt about his death was felt privately, in the English home she had made for herself, without any public statement that the press of the day was able to obtain. She did not attend his funeral in Rome. Whether this was a choice or a consequence of the wartime conditions that made travel difficult is something the accounts of the period do not resolve cleanly. The ambiguity is itself a document of a marriage whose terms, even in death, resisted the simple resolution that other people's narratives about it required. He was gone. Spain was still there, under Franco, unreachable and present, in the way that the place you have given 25 years of your life is always present, regardless of whether you can return to it. The children were distributed across the exile's geography, navigating their own accommodations with the loss of the world they had grown up in. The haemophiliac sons were alive, for now, managing the condition that had defined their childhoods and that had defined, through the mechanism of blame, the terms of their parents' marriage. Ina was in England with her memories and her connections, and the particular quality of a woman who has survived something that was supposed to break her, and has discovered, in the surviving, that the something was not sufficient to the task. She had been blamed for the dynasty's blood. The dynasty was gone. She remained. The haemophilia that defined Enna's marriage also defined her motherhood, and the two definitions operated in entirely different registers. The haemophilia that destroyed her relationship with Alfonso was a weapon in his hands, a fact he used against her, a blame he directed at her, a grievance he sustained across 25 years of marriage, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that his suffering requires an author, and has assigned the authorship without examining the assignment. The haemophilia that shaped her relationship with her sons was something else entirely. It was a medical reality that she engaged with as a medical reality, not as a symbol of her failure or a punishment for her origins, but as a condition that her children had, that required specific management, and that she was going to manage with every resource available to her, regardless of what the management cost. Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, was the eldest son and the first to manifest the condition. He was born in 1907, and his haemophilia was discovered at the circumcision that had been the moment of revelation for his father and the beginning of the blame that followed. He grew up as the heir to the Spanish throne, with the specific complications that haemophilia imposed on a child, whose position required him to be physically present at public occasions, that normal childhood injury made dangerous, who had to be protected from the falls and the knocks that childhood produces, without the protection being so visible that it communicated the weakness that the position of heir could not afford to communicate. Ina managed this with the practical ingenuity that the situation required. She worked with the physicians who treated her sons to understand haemophilia's management as thoroughly as the medical knowledge of the period permitted, which was more thoroughly than most parents of haemophiliac children in the early 20th century understood it, because most parents did not have the resources or the education to engage with medical knowledge at the level that Ina brought to it. She was not simply receiving the doctor's instructions and following them. She was learning the condition's mechanisms, understanding its patterns, developing the observational capacity to identify the early signs of a bleeding episode before it became a crisis that the doctors needed to manage. The royal household's physicians found in her a parent who was more informed about her son's condition than they were sometimes comfortable with, which is the experience of doctors whose patients' families have engaged with the relevant medical literature and whose engagement challenges the professional hierarchy that medicine of that period maintained between the doctor and the patient's family. She did not differ on matters where her sustained observation of her sons gave her knowledge that the physician's periodic contact with them did not provide. She insisted on being present for the consultations and the treatments and the discussions of management strategy that the physicians would have preferred to conduct without the Queen's direct participation. This insistence was not popular with the physicians. It was also effective. The accounts of the prince's medical care during the years of the reign describe a management of their condition that was, by the standards available in the early 20th century, genuinely skilled. Not because the medical tools available had improved beyond what the period offered, but because the person coordinating their application was applying them with a consistency and an attentiveness that improved their effectiveness. Alfonso the Younger, as he was distinguished from his father in the household's daily life, was a child of considerable personal appeal. He had his father's dark coloring and his mother's blue eyes, and the combination produced a young man who attracted the kind of affection that physically striking people attract, regardless of their other qualities. Though his other qualities were genuine, he was intelligent, socially warm, and possessed of the specific charm that people develop when they have grown up at the center of a court's social world and have absorbed its conversational grammar from childhood. He was also reckless in the way that young men who have grown up with a condition that imposes constant physical limitation sometimes become reckless when the opportunity to escape the limitation presents itself. The recklessness was not stupidity. He understood the risks that his condition imposed on certain activities better than anyone outside his immediate family. It was the recklessness of someone who had been managing risk his entire life and who had developed, through the management, a relationship with risk that normalized its presence rather than eliminating it. He fell in love, in his early 20s, with a Cuban woman named Edelmira Sampedro Robato. The relationship produced a marriage that Alfonso contracted in 1933, after the exile had begun, after the monarchy had fallen, after the formal structures that the heir to the Spanish throne would have navigated in contracting a marriage had dissolved along with the institution that had produced those structures. The marriage was contracted, therefore, with the relative freedom of a man who was no longer heir to anything formal and who was therefore, at least in the personal dimension, free to choose on the basis of personal preference rather than dynastic requirement. The marriage was not long. Alfonso was killed in a car accident in Florida in 1938, not from haemophilia directly, but from the combination of haemophilia and car accident that is among the most dangerous combinations available to a haemophiliac. The injuries from the crash would not have been fatal to a person without the condition. To Alfonso, they were fatal within days, because the internal bleeding that the injuries produced could not be controlled with the medical resources available in Florida in 1938. He was 31 years old. Enna received the news in England and received it with the composure that the decades of managing her son's condition had installed in her as a defense against the specific quality of fear that haemophilia produces in its parents. The knowledge that any ordinary event can become a crisis, that the phone call with bad news is always possible, that the preparation for it is the only available response to its possibility. The preparation did not make the reality easier, it made the visible management of the reality more possible, which is a different thing, and the distinction between those two things is something that Ina understood, and that the people who observed her composure at Alfonso's death consistently misunderstood as absence of grief rather than presence of discipline. Gonzalo was the youngest son, born in 1914, the second of the two haemophiliac princes. He was by temperament the quieter of the two, less publicly charismatic than Alfonso, more given to the private pursuits that his conditions management required him to spend considerable time with, and possessed of an intelligence that expressed itself in the academic direction rather than the social one. He studied, in the years of the exile, with a seriousness that suggested a person making productive use of the circumstances that the exile had produced. The removal from the royal role that would otherwise have occupied him had opened space for the intellectual engagement that the role's demands might have crowded out. He was also killed in a car accident in Austria in 1934, at the age of 19. The circumstances were similar to his brother's eventual death. An accident that injured a person without haemophilia would not have killed, that injured a haemophiliac could not be survived. He was the younger of the two haemophiliac sons, and he died first, 4 years before Alfonso's death in Florida. And the sequence of the deaths, the younger before the elder, the one who had barely had the chance to construct an adult life before the other, whose construction was more advanced, produced in Ina a grief whose character the people around her during this period describe with a care that suggests the grief was of a kind that simple observation was insufficient to fully capture. She had watched both of her haemophiliac sons navigate the condition from infancy. She had managed their crises, coordinated their medical care, maintained across the years the sustained attention that haemophilia's management requires from the person who is closest to its sufferer on a daily basis. She had done all of this inside a marriage where the condition was a weapon directed at her, rather than a shared challenge to be navigated together, which meant that the burden of the management fell on her, without the partnership that shared parenting provides, and without the acknowledgement that the sharing of a burden requires to be fully borne. The deaf son, Jaime, the second child, born in 1908, had his own complicated relationship with the dynastic world his birth had placed him in. His deafness, which resulted from a childhood infection and subsequent surgery, removed him from the line of succession in the formal sense, because the royal family's assessment of the succession's requirements included the capacity for the full performance of the royal role that Jaime's deafness was judged to preclude. He renounced his rights in 1933, under circumstances whose voluntary character has been disputed by subsequent accounts. The pressure that exile and the collapse of the monarchy placed on a deaf young man whose dynastic significance had already been formally diminished was pressure that made the concept of voluntary renunciation complicated to assess. Enna's relationship with Jaime across the years of his life was the most consistently warm of her relationships with the children, not because she loved him more than the others, but because the specific circumstances of his position, the deafness, the formal exclusion from the succession, the exile's particular impact on someone whose identity had been structured around a role that the exile had made unavailable, produced a child who needed from his mother a kind of sustained attention that was different in character from the medical attention the haemophiliac sons required, and that Ina was equipped to provide in the specific form it required. She had spent 25 years being the person who was blamed for what her children were. She had never been given the credit for what she did for them, inside the shadow of that blame. The medical management, the sustained attention, the protection of her son's dignity in a court that viewed their conditions as evidence of their mother's genetic failure, all of this was performed without acknowledgement in the years of the reign and without record in the official account that followed. The official account remembered her as the queen who brought haemophilia into the Spanish throne. It did not remember her as the mother who managed that haemophilia's consequences with more skill and more sustained devotion than anyone else in her children's lives. The two memories belong to the same woman, and the account that contains only the first without the second is the account that the institution found useful and produced accordingly. Both her haemophiliac sons were dead before she reached 60. The condition that had defined her marriage and her motherhood and her position in the Spanish court had claimed the two lives she had spent the most effort protecting. The claiming was not her failure, it was the condition's nature, operating within the limits of the medical knowledge available to address it, against which her sustained effort had extended her sons' lives beyond what less attentive management would have produced. That extension is not in the record. The blame is. The distance between those two facts is the distance between the woman who actually lived inside this story and the woman that the story, as it has been preserved, requires its subject to be. Lausanne in the 1940s was a city full of displaced Europeans, people who had been removed from their countries by the political catastrophes of the preceding decade and who had settled in Switzerland's particular neutrality with the mixture of relief and suspension that exile produces when it has lasted long enough to feel permanent without having lasted long enough to feel final. The Swiss cities had absorbed royals and politicians and aristocrats from across the continent with the pragmatic hospitality of a country whose financial system benefited from the presence of people with assets to protect, and whose political neutrality made it the available destination when every other destination had been foreclosed. Ina arrived in Lausanne in the 1940s and stayed for the better part of 2 decades, making of the city the kind of home that exile allows, functional, genuine in its own way, and permanently shadowed by the awareness that it is a substitute for somewhere else. She had been in England after the exile's beginning in 1931, and England had provided the family connections and the familiar cultural formation that the first years of displacement required. Switzerland provided something different, a distance from the British royal family that her changed circumstances made desirable, a neutral ground where the specific weight of being a former queen could be carried without the constant social negotiation that carrying it in England required. She was not poor. This requires stating clearly, because the accounts of her exile years sometimes imply a reduced circumstance that the evidence does not fully support. She had resources, not the resources of a reigning queen, not the financial support of an institution whose continuation guaranteed a standard of living, but the personal assets that the years of the reign had accumulated and that the exile's beginning had not entirely consumed. She lived in Lausanne in a manner that was comfortable rather than grand, which was an adjustment from the palaces and the formal households of the reign, but which was not the privation that exile sometimes produces in people whose previous lives had provided no preparation for its management. The preparation she had received had been, if anything, better than she would have wished. The years of the reign, the financial difficulties of a court that spent beyond its means, the management of a household whose resources Alfonso's particular relationship to money had made consistently uncertain, the negotiation of domestic economies that the formal grandeur of royal life required to be invisible, had given her a practical relationship to the management of limited resources that many women of her background and her period had never needed to develop. She developed it anyway, during the exile years, with the same competence she had brought to everything the reign had required of her. She lived within the means available to her. She maintained the social connections that sustained her quality of life without the financial resources that would have made maintaining them easier. She received visitors and made visits and conducted the social life of a former queen with the dignity that the dignity required and without the bitterness that the circumstances might have justified. The bitterness question is central to any honest account of Enna's exile years, and the accounts that exist are divided on it in ways that reflect the source's proximity to her and their interest in her story's emotional texture. The official accounts, the accounts shaped by people with an interest in presenting the former queen as a figure of noble stoicism, describe an Enna who bore the exile with equanimity, who found in Switzerland a genuine peace that the turbulence of the reign had never provided, who was released by the exile from obligations that had never suited her temperament, and who therefore experienced the release as something more complex than simple loss. The accounts from people who knew her more intimately during this period describe a woman who was more complicated than equanimity captures. She missed Spain. This is not the simple nostalgia of someone who remembers a place fondly. It is the specific missing of a person who had given 25 years of her life to a country, and who had never been permitted by that country to feel that the giving had been received. The missing was not for the palaces, or the ceremonies, or the formal grandeur of the Queen's life. It was for the Spain that had existed beneath those things, the country itself, its landscape, its people, the specific texture of a daily life that she had never quite been allowed to inhabit as her own, but that had been her context for a quarter century. She read the Spanish newspapers when she could obtain them. She followed the developments of the Franco years. The republic that had replaced the monarchy had itself been replaced by the dictatorship that the Civil War had produced, and the Spain that existed in the 1940s was a Spain that bore almost no resemblance to the Spain she had known. Franco's relationship to the monarchy was complicated and deliberate. He was not a republican, but he was also not prepared to restore the Bourbon dynasty on terms that would have limited his own authority, and his management of the monarchist sentiment within Spain was a sustained exercise in keeping an option open without exercising it. The option was the restoration, the question of whether the Bourbon dynasty would be restored, and in what form, and on whose terms, occupied the exiled royal family across the Franco decades, in the way that the central question of a family's future occupies families who have no other question of equal weight. Enna's position in this question was the position of a woman who had been formally separated from Alfonso before his death, and who was therefore not the widow of the pretender to the throne, but the former wife of the man who had been king, a distinction that the dynastic politics of the exile period found difficult to accommodate cleanly. Her son Juan, Don Juan, as the pretender's supporters referred to him, the Count of Barcelona, became the focal point of the monarchist cause after Alfonso's death in 1941. Juan had not inherited the haemophilia that had claimed his two brothers, which gave him a physical freedom to engage with the world that his brother's condition had constrained. He was intelligent and politically serious and genuinely committed to the constitutional monarchy that his father's abdication, or suspension, in the dynastic terminology, had interrupted, and he pursued the restoration cause with the persistence that the cause required and the patience that Franco's management of the question demanded. Ina's relationship with Juan during the exile years was the most politically engaged relationship of her exile, more engaged than her relationship with the Spanish monarchist movement in general, which was a movement whose internal divisions and whose relationship to Franco's Spain she observed with the same clear-eyed assessment she had brought to the political landscape of the reign. She supported Juan's position. She communicated, through the channels available to a former queen operating in neutral Switzerland, the diplomatic and social connections that her years as a reigning monarch had produced, and that her exile had not entirely dissolved. These connections were real and were not trivial. The European royal family network that Victoria's descendants maintained, the connections to the British royal family, to the remaining royal houses of Europe, to the diplomatic world that intersected with those houses, represented a form of soft power that Ina had accumulated across decades, and that the exile had reduced without eliminating. She used what remained with the practical intelligence of someone who understood that informal influence was the only kind available to her, and that its effectiveness depended on its being applied selectively and accurately. The British royal family's relationship with Ina during the exile years was a relationship conducted across the particular distance that complicated family histories produce. They were cousins, she was the granddaughter of Victoria, the connections were real and acknowledged, and the complications of her Spanish life and her separation from Alfonso had produced a situation whose navigation required the careful management that complicated family situations in royal contexts always require. She was received, when she visited England, with the warmth that genuine family affection produces, and with the formality that the constitutional position of the British monarchy made appropriate when receiving a former queen whose country's political situation was sensitive. She visited England periodically. The visits became a rhythm of the exile years. Switzerland as the base, England as the connection to the family formation that Spain had never replaced and exile had made more, rather than less important. The visits produced occasions for the connection to her surviving children, for the maintenance of the friendships that the decades had developed, for the reception of the news about Spain that the people she saw in England were better positioned to provide than the Swiss newspapers. She aged in Lausanne with the specific quality of aging that people develop when the life they are living is a life that contains something important that has been deferred, not the aging of someone who has finished with the world, but the aging of someone who is still waiting for a resolution that the world has not yet produced. The restoration of the Spanish monarchy was the resolution she was waiting for, not for herself personally. She was not expecting to return to Madrid as queen, but as the vindication of the 25 years she had spent inside an institution whose collapse had been presented as confirmation of its failure. She wanted Spain to confirm that the monarchy had been worth what she had given to it. She wanted the restoration to produce the evidence that the giving had meant something, that the 25 years of managing the court's coldness and Alfonso's blame and the haemophiliac son's crises and the political turbulence of a reign that had ended in exile had been the giving of something genuinely valuable to a genuinely valuable institution, rather than the giving of a life to something that history had judged a failure. The restoration, when it eventually came, was not what she expected. It came in a form she could not have anticipated. Through Franco's decision to designate Juan Carlos, Juan's son and her grandson, as his successor rather than Juan himself, bypassing the generation that had been waiting and producing a restoration that was simultaneously the vindication she had been waiting for, and the most complicated possible form of that vindication. She was in her 80s by the time Juan Carlos became King of Spain in 1975. She had been waiting for 44 years. The waiting had been the structure of the exile years, the patient, sustained, occasionally painful waiting of a woman who had decided that Spain owed her something, and that she would wait until Spain delivered it. She returned to Spain before the restoration was formally complete, as a visitor rather than as a queen, to attend the wedding of Juan Carlos in 1962. The return was her first time in Spain since 1931. She was 74 years old. She stood in the Spanish soil that she had left on the morning of the 14th of April 1931, and whatever she felt in that moment, she felt privately, with the composure that had been the consistent external quality of everything she had felt for 60 years. The Spain she had returned to was Franco's Spain, not the Spain she had left, and not the Spain she had been waiting for. The Spain she had been waiting for was still in the future. She was still waiting. The wedding of Juan Carlos of Bourbon and Princess Sophia of Greece took place in Athens in May 1962. Enna attended. She was 74 years old and had been in exile for 31 years, and the wedding was the occasion that provided the framework, the family occasion, the celebration, the context in which her presence could be understood as personal rather than political, for the return to Spanish soil that her exile's political conditions had prevented for 3 decades. She flew to Madrid afterward. The decision to go to Madrid, rather than returning directly to Lausanne from Athens, was not an impulsive one. It had been discussed, arranged, cleared through the diplomatic channels that Franco's Spain required to be cleared before a former queen could visit the country she had reigned over, without the visit being interpreted as a political statement whose implications the regime had not approved. The regime approved it, in the careful way that Franco's Spain approved things it could not straightforwardly refuse, without the refusal generating more political cost than the approval. Her visit was framed as private, family, without political significance, the return of an elderly grandmother rather than the return of a queen. The framing was inaccurate in the way that political framings of human events always are inaccurate. The event and its framing coexist without one eliminating the other, and the people who witnessed the return understood both simultaneously. She was an elderly grandmother. She was also the woman who had been Queen of Spain for 25 years, and who had been absent from the country for 31 years, and whose return, whatever the official framing said about its political significance, was an event that the Spaniards who saw her understood in their own terms rather than the regime's. The reception in Madrid surprised the people who had expected the political framing to determine the public response. The Spaniards who came out to see her, and they came, in numbers that the unofficial nature of the visit had not been expected to produce, received her with a warmth that the 31 years of absence had not diminished in the way that the exile's architects might have hoped. She was old and she moved carefully, and the woman who had ridden in the open carriage on the Calle Mayor in 1906 was visible only in the quality of her bearing, in the specific composure that she had maintained across 60 years of events. That composure had been required to manage. She visited the places that the visit permitted her to visit. She saw the people that the visit allowed her to see. She moved through a Madrid that was Franco's Madrid, a city shaped by the 40 years of the dictatorship's particular cultural and architectural intervention, a city that bore the marks of the civil war and the regime's subsequent management of the country, in ways that the Madrid she had left in 1931 had not prepared her for. She absorbed the differences with the observational attention that she brought to everything, and she made no public comment about what the differences signified, because public comment about what the differences signified was not something the official framing of the visit accommodated. She returned to Lausanne. The visit had been what it had been, a beginning of something, a first return after a very long absence, a demonstration that the return was possible, and that the reception it produced was warmer than the political conditions of the exile might have suggested. It was not a resolution. The resolution that she had been waiting for, the restoration of the monarchy that would vindicate the 25 years of the reign and the 31 years of the exile, was still in the future, still dependent on Franco's decisions about the succession and Juan's position and the complicated dynastic arithmetic of a situation that Franco had been managing to his own advantage for decades. She returned to Spain again periodically across the 1960s, visits that became more frequent as the political situation within Spain shifted in ways that made the monarchy's restoration appear increasingly likely, and as her own age made the logistics of the visits more challenging, and therefore the decision to make them more deliberate. Each visit was managed within the constraints of the official framing, private, family, non-political, and each was received by the Spaniards who were present for it in ways that demonstrated the gap between the official framing and the actual significance of what they were witnessing. She was in her 80s by this point, and the aging had not produced the diminishment that age sometimes produces in people whose primary quality has been physical. She had not been a queen whose authority rested on her beauty, though she had been beautiful, or on her physical presence, though she had possessed it. Her authority had rested on something more durable, and the durability was visible in the quality of her bearing in her 80s, in the same way that it had been visible in her 20s on the Calle Mayor. The dynastic question resolved itself in 1969, when Franco designated Juan Carlos as his successor, bypassing Juan, the Count of Barcelona, who had been the pretender through the exile decades, and whose bypassing was the most politically consequential decision of the restoration process. The bypassing was not simple or clean. It produced within the monarchist movement the kind of internal division that the bypassing of an expected succession always produces, and it placed Juan in the position of a man who had spent his adult life preparing for a role that had been given to his son. Ina's position on the bypassing was complicated by the competing loyalties that the dynastic situation produced. Loyalty to Juan, her son, whose bypassing was a personal as well as a political loss, and recognition that Juan Carlos, her grandson, represented in his youth and his formation and his relationship to the Spain that actually existed in 1969, a more viable vehicle for the restoration than his father had become across the decades of the exile. She did not state her position publicly. She was 81 years old, and she had spent a lifetime not stating her positions publicly on the political questions that she understood most clearly, and the bypassing decision was not the occasion on which she was going to change that discipline. She held the competing loyalties privately and managed their tension with the composure that competing loyalties in families always require to be managed, and the management was visible to the people around her as characteristic rather than remarkable, because composure in the face of difficulty had been characteristic for so long that its appearance in any specific instance was unremarkable. Juan Carlos became King of Spain on the 22nd of November 1975, 2 days after Franco's death. He was 37 years old. He had been prepared for the role by a preparation that was unlike any other royal formation in the 20th century, raised partly in Spain at Franco's direction, educated within the institutions of the regime, positioned as the regime's chosen successor, and yet emerging from this formation as the person who would dismantle the regime's political structure and construct in its place the constitutional democracy that Spain's transition produced. Ina did not live to see the constitutional monarchy formally established. She died on the 15th of April 1969, 6 years before Franco's death and the restoration that followed it. She was 81 years old, and she died in Lausanne, in the Swiss city that had been her home for the better part of 3 decades, having returned to Spain several times in her final years, but having never returned as queen or in any formal capacity that acknowledged what the 25 years of the reign had been. The timing of her death relative to the restoration is the fact about her life that the subsequent accounts find most difficult to accommodate comfortably, because it means that the vindication she had spent 40 years waiting for arrived 6 years after she was no longer alive to receive it. The monarchy was restored. Spain became a constitutional democracy of the kind she had understood from childhood. The institution she had given her adult life to was rehabilitated by the very process she had been waiting for. She was not there. The not being there is not a tragedy in any simple sense. She had lived 81 years, had survived the bomb on the Calle Mayor and the haemophilia's consequences, and the marriage's sustained damage, and 3 decades of exile, and had died in her own home, surrounded by people who cared for her, which is a death that the Calle Mayor's arithmetic had suggested might not be available to her at 23. But the not being there is a comment on the relationship between the pace of institutional change and the pace of individual lives, on the specific cruelty that history sometimes produces when the vindication that a life has been working toward arrives after the life has ended. When the restoration comes 6 years too late, when the monarchy that she had maintained through the exile years by her continued dignity and her diplomatic connections and her patient waiting was restored to a Spain that could no longer offer her the acknowledgement that the restoration was supposed to contain. Juan Carlos became king, and the Spain that he governed was a Spain that remembered Ina as part of its monarchical history without having received her back as a living participant in the restoration's beginning. The photographs of the new king's coronation do not contain her. The celebrations that marked Franco's death and the beginning of the transition do not contain her. The constitutional monarchy that the transition produced, the institution she had spent her exile waiting for, exists without any record of her receiving the vindication that its existence represented. She had been patient for 40 years. The patience ran out 6 years before it needed to. History did not adjust its timing to accommodate her. It rarely does. There is a category of loss that has no adequate name in any language because it is too specific to be captured by the general vocabulary that loss produces. It is the loss of a world you built yourself, in a place that was not your native one, using materials that required your conversion and your learning and your crossing of distances that most people never cross. And the loss comes not from a single event, but from the accumulated pressure of an institution that used everything you gave it and returned almost none of it in the form that giving requires to be sustainable. Ina lost this world twice. She lost it first, gradually and daily, across the 25 years of the reign, the world of a queen who had expected to be received by Spain and who discovered that Spain's reception had conditions she had not been told about and could not meet, because the conditions were genetic and therefore beyond the reach of conversion or language learning or any other act of will. She lost it second, definitively, in April 1931, when the Republic replaced the monarchy and the world she had been building, imperfectly and inside sustained opposition, for a quarter century, was dismantled in the days following a municipal election whose results nobody in the court had been fully prepared for. What Spain took from her is easier to enumerate than what she refused to surrender, because taking leaves evidence in the record, and refusing to surrender leaves only its result, the continued presence of the thing that was supposed to have been taken. Spain took her children's health. The haemophilia that ran through the family she produced with Alfonso was not simply a medical condition. It was the condition that defined her public identity in Spain, that organized the court's attitude toward her, that provided Alfonso with the framework for the blame he directed at her throughout the marriage. It was the thing she was, to the court and to the king who had chosen her, the woman who had brought the bad blood, the carrier of the defect, the source of the dynasty's medical tragedy. Spain took her marriage in the substantive sense before it took it in the formal one. The marriage that ended in the separation document of 1934 had ended in 1907, in the room where Alfonso received the news of his firstborn son's haemophilia, and the 27 years between that ending and the document that acknowledged it were 27 years of living inside something that had already concluded, with the specific quality of duration that endurance produces when the thing being endured has no obvious terminal point and no mechanism for resolution. Spain took her social world. The court that had never accepted her was the court she was required to inhabit for 25 years, and the inhabitation was not the comfortable inhabitation of a woman who has found her place in the world she chose, but the sustained management of a woman who has understood that the place she has chosen has not chosen her back. The social world of a queen is not optional. It is the medium in which the role is performed, and performing the role inside a social world that has directed its warmth away from the person performing it is a specific form of professional difficulty that has no civilian equivalent. Spain took her sons. Both haemophiliac princes died in accidents that their condition made fatal. Gonzalo in Austria in 1934, Alfonso in Florida in 1938. The deaths were not Spain's direct responsibility in any straightforward causal sense, but they were the product of the haemophilia that Spain had made the defining fact of her queenship, and the sons themselves had been shaped by the specific conditions of their royal Spanish identity in ways that connected their deaths to the world that had produced them. She outlived both of them, which is the loss that parents describe as the one loss that the vocabulary of grief cannot adequately contain. Spain took her home. The Alcázar and the Royal Palace of Madrid, and the summer palaces and the Escorial, and all the formal residences of the Spanish monarchy, were places that she had inhabited for 25 years, and that the exile's beginning had removed from her access, with the totality that political transformation always produces. The physical places of a life, the rooms where things happened, the gardens where things were felt, the specific light in the specific windows of the specific buildings that comprised the daily environment of 25 years, cannot be taken in the legal sense. They can only be made inaccessible, and inaccessibility over sufficient time produces the same result as taking. What she refused to surrender is the harder accounting, because refusal without surrender leaves no obvious evidence of the refusal's existence, only the evidence of the thing that was not surrendered. She refused to surrender her dignity. This is stated in every account of her life, and is so consistently stated that its repetition risks making it feel like a formula rather than a description. The dignity was real, and it was specific. Not the dignity of someone performing composure for an audience, but the dignity of a woman who had decided, at some point in the years of the reign, that the institution and the man who ran it could take a great deal from her, but could not take the quality of her own self-understanding, and who had maintained that understanding against the sustained pressure of a court that needed her to be what the blame required her to be. She refused to surrender her connection to the children who survived. Jaime, the deaf son who had renounced his succession rights in 1933, remained a presence in her life through the exile years and beyond. A complicated presence, given the circumstances of the renunciation and the dynastic politics that surrounded it, but a genuine one, the connection of a mother to a son whose difficulties she had understood more directly than the official accounts of those difficulties suggested. The daughters, Beatrice and Maria Cristina, provided a different dimension of connection. The daughters who carried the haemophilia gene without expressing it, who navigated their own marriages and their own lives in the specific shadow of the family's history, and whose relationships with their mother were the relationships of women who had grown up watching a particular kind of feminine endurance and who had formed their own relationships to endurance accordingly. She refused to surrender her interest in Spain. The 31 years of the exile did not produce in her the indifference to Spain that exile sometimes produces in people, for whom the exiled country eventually becomes a place associated primarily with loss, and therefore best managed through emotional distance. She remained interested in Spain with the specific quality of interest that people maintain in places they have invested themselves in. Not the sentimental interest of nostalgia, but the engaged interest of someone who still has a stake in the outcome and who is following developments with the attention that a stake requires. She refused to surrender her capacity for pleasure. This is the detail that the accounts of her exile years most consistently produce, and that the standard narratives of her life most consistently undervalue. The evidence that a woman who had experienced the sustained difficulty of her particular history was also a woman who found genuine pleasure in specific things, and who pursued those pleasures with the directness of someone who had learned through experience not to defer pleasures that the present moment makes available. She enjoyed the social life that Lausanne provided, within its particular limits. She enjoyed the visits to England, the family connections, the specific warmth of people who had known her across the decades, and whose knowledge of her history gave the connection a depth that new acquaintances could not provide. She enjoyed the grandchildren, Juan Carlos and his siblings, the children of her surviving sons and daughters, with the particular quality of enjoyment that grandparents often find in grandchildren when the parenting that preceded them was conducted under conditions that made its enjoyment difficult. The grandchildren knew her as someone different from the queen the historical record described. They knew her as a woman who was present with them in the specific way that presence requires, attentive, engaged, interested in who they were rather than in who they were supposed to become. The Juan Carlos who would become King of Spain had a grandmother who was entirely clear-eyed about what the kingship required and who communicated that clarity to him, not through formal instruction, but through the quality of a relationship that had been conducted across his entire childhood. What she communicated, across the decades of the exile, to the person who would eventually restore the monarchy she had spent 25 years serving, was not a set of instructions about how to be king. It was something harder to transmit, and more durable in its effects. The specific knowledge of what the institution costs the people inside it, what it takes from them, and what it requires them to refuse to surrender, and what the difference between those two things means for the quality of the life that the institution contains. Juan Carlos became king in 1975. The constitutional monarchy that he established in the years following Franco's death was a monarchy shaped by many forces: the transition's political dynamics, the pressure of Spanish civil society, the influence of the European democratic models that Spain was seeking to join. It was also shaped, in ways that the formal historical account does not easily accommodate, by the formation of the man who established it, and the formation of that man included the grandmother who had told him, through 40 years of exile and several visits to a Switzerland apartment, what the institution was and what it required. The monarchy she helped shape outlived her by 6 years before it was formally established. She never saw it. She left behind a Spain that was not yet what she had been waiting for, and she left behind a grandson who would make it what she had been waiting for. And the relationship between those two facts is the most complete account available of what Anna of Spain actually was. Not the queen who brought haemophilia to the throne, not the foreign woman who never quite arrived, but the woman who gave the dynasty something more durable than good blood. She gave it continuity, she gave it the patience to wait, she gave it the knowledge of what dignified endurance looks like when the institution you have committed to is not yet what you need it to be, and may not be in your lifetime. The institution received the gift. It did not acknowledge the giver. That too was characteristic. History's verdicts on women who lived inside powerful institutions are rarely the verdicts that the evidence supports. They are the verdicts that the institutions found useful to produce, and that the record-keeping apparatus of those institutions was positioned to sustain. The institutions write the initial drafts. The initial drafts become the established accounts. The established accounts become the received understanding that subsequent generations inherit without examining the conditions of its production. Anna of Spain received a verdict that the institution she served produced in the years of her reign, and that the exile's distance made difficult to contest. The verdict was simple, and was stated repeatedly, and was absorbed into the general understanding of her story, with the efficiency that simple verdicts always achieve when they are repeated often enough by people with sufficient authority to make their repetition feel like confirmation rather than assertion. She brought haemophilia into the Spanish throne. Her husband never forgave her. Both statements are accurate. Neither constitutes a verdict. They are facts about what happened. Specific, bounded, documentable facts. And the transformation of those facts into a verdict required the omission of the context that would have made the verdict unsustainable. The context is everything that this account has attempted to restore. The context is the medical reality of 1906, in which the carrier status of a young woman with no haemophiliac brothers and no established history of the condition in her immediate family was not something that the medicine of the period could have identified or that any reasonable premarital assessment would have uncovered. The context is the character of Alfonso's blame, its irrationality, its persistence, its function as a displacement of the grief and frustration that a king who had wanted a healthy dynasty and received a compromised one needed to place somewhere, and the somewhere he chose. The context is the 25 years of Anna's service to the Spanish throne, the management of the court's coldness, the endurance of the affair's humiliation, the sustained care of the haemophiliac sons, the political intelligence that the institution used without acknowledging, the composure on the Calle Mayor that established, on the first day of her queenship, the quality of character that would sustain the entire reign. The context is also the exile, the 31 years of Lausanne, and patient waiting, and diplomatic maintenance of connections that kept the monarchist cause viable when its viability was genuinely uncertain, the returns to Spain that demonstrated the continuity of her connection to the country that had treated her as an instrument rather than a person, the relationship with Juan Carlos that transmitted something essential about the institution across the gap that the exile produced. The verdict that omits this context is the verdict that the Spanish court needed because the court had organized its treatment of Anna around the blame, and a verdict that complicated the blame would have required the court to examine the behavior that the blame had justified. Courts are not institutions that examine their own behavior toward the people they have mistreated with greater enthusiasm than the minimum that external pressure requires. The Spanish court under Alfonso had mistreated Anna in ways that the blame provided the justification for, and the perpetuation of the verdict perpetuated the justification, and therefore the absolution of everyone who had participated in the mistreatment. The absolution has lasted. The accounts of Alfonso's reign that center the haemophilia story tend to center it in terms that confirm the court's original position. Ina brought the bad blood. Alfonso suffered the consequences. The tragedy was hers in the sense of being her doing. These accounts are not fabricated. They contain the facts. They omit the context that would require those facts to be understood differently. The revisionist accounts that have appeared in the decades since the Spanish democracy's establishment have done better work. The scholarship of the transition period and the years following it, which had access to archives that the Franco era had managed and that the democratic period opened, produced a more complicated picture of the reign, more honest about Alfonso's character, more specific about the court's treatment of Ina, more engaged with the actual human being rather than the institutional function she was required to perform. The revisionist scholarship has not fully replaced the popular understanding. Popular understandings of historical figures are more durable than the scholarship that revises them, because popular understandings do not require engagement with primary sources, or familiarity with the archives, or the willingness to hold two contradictory accounts of the same person in mind simultaneously and assess their relative claims on the evidence. Popular understandings require only repetition, and the original verdict has been repeated for longer and in more accessible forms than the revisions that have complicated it. What Ina was, beneath the verdict and the revision and the competing accounts of her significance, was a woman of genuine quality, placed inside circumstances that were designed, by a combination of bad luck and institutional cruelty, to prevent that quality from being visible. The quality was visible anyway, to the people who were close enough and honest enough to see it, and the accounts of those people, the letters, the memoirs, the recollections of the grandchildren and the surviving family members, and the diplomatic observers who saw her clearly, constitute a record that the popular understanding has not adequately absorbed. She was intelligent with the specific quality of intelligence that produces accurate assessments of people and situations under conditions that would compromise most observers' accuracy. She was politically perceptive in ways that the institution she served was organized to prevent from mattering. She was medically engaged with her son's condition in ways that extended their lives beyond what less attentive management would have produced. She was socially courageous in the specific sense that courage requires in environments where the social pressure is directed at producing collapse. She did not collapse, not on the Calle Mayor, and not in the court's sustained coldness, and not in the exile's particular form of displacement. She was also, and this is the dimension of her character that the official accounts most consistently undervalue, a woman who found ways to be genuinely alive inside the constraints that her circumstances imposed. The pleasure she took in the grandchildren, the warmth of the English visits, the engagement with Switzerland's particular social world, the correspondence that sustained her connections across the decades of separation from the people those connections required. These are not the details of a woman who survived her circumstances by retreating from them. They are the details of a woman who remained present in her own life, despite circumstances that provided consistent incentive for the retreat. The retreat would have been understandable. She did not take it. The not taking of it is not celebrated in any of the accounts that constitute her historical record, because the historical record of a queen is interested in queens as institutional figures rather than as people making daily choices about the quality of their own presence in their own lives. The daily choices are invisible in the institutional record. They are visible only in the human record, in the accounts of people who were present for them, in the correspondence that preserves their texture, in the recollections of the grandchildren who knew her in the Lausanne apartment, and who found in her something that the institutional record does not capture. Juan Carlos found in her the specific knowledge of what the institution he was going to lead had cost the people who had served it before him. The knowledge was transmitted, not through formal instruction, but through the quality of a relationship, through the way she talked about Spain and about the monarchy, and about the specific conditions that made the monarchy worth restoring, and the specific conditions that had made the previous version of it unable to sustain itself. He received the transmission and used it, in the years of the transition, in ways that the historical account of the Spanish democracy acknowledges in general terms, without being specific about the sources. The source, in part, was a grandmother in a Lausanne apartment who had spent 40 years thinking about what the monarchy should have been and what it had actually been, and what the difference between those two things required the next version to do differently. She died on the 15th of April 1969 in Lausanne, without the formal acknowledgement that the institution she had served across 25 years of its operation and 38 years of its exile owed her and did not produce. The Spanish state under Franco did not formally mark her death in ways that acknowledged the reign's significance. The monarchist movement mourned her within its own community. The British royal family acknowledged the death of a cousin. The Swiss newspapers noted the death of a former queen who had been resident in Lausanne for several decades. The verdict that had been produced in the Spanish court in the early years of the 20th century was reproduced in the coverage of her death, with the efficiency of verdicts that have been repeated long enough to feel like facts rather than positions. She was the queen who had brought haemophilia into the Spanish throne. Her husband had never forgiven her. Neither statement was wrong. Neither constituted the truth of who she was. The truth of who she was required the context that the verdict had been produced specifically to omit, and the omission was still operating in the coverage of her death 50 years after the original verdict had been produced. She deserved better from the country she had given her adult life to. She deserved better from the husband who had blamed her for something she had not done with the knowledge that the doing required. She deserved better from the historical record that has perpetuated his position across the century since it was first established. The deserving changes nothing about what she received. It changes something about how we should read what she received, not as evidence of what she was, but as evidence of what the institution that produced the verdict needed her to be. What she actually was remains available in the record, for anyone willing to look past the verdict to the woman it was designed to obscure. The looking is not difficult. The woman is there, in the letters and the diplomatic accounts and the recollections of the people who knew her in Lausanne, and in the Spanish visits, and in the quality of the king her grandson became. She is there. She has always been there. The verdict simply required that you not look directly at her. Look directly at her. The verdict does not survive the looking. Victoria of the United Kingdom died in January 1901, having given the world 42 grandchildren, distributed across the royal houses of Europe, with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who understood that dynastic marriage was the most durable foreign policy available to a 19th century monarch. She had also given the world something she did not know she was giving, the haemophilia gene that ran through her female descendants and that expressed itself in her male ones, passing silently through the women who carried it and appearing, without warning, in the sons those women produced. The science that would have allowed Victoria to understand what she was transmitting did not exist in her lifetime. The concept of genetic inheritance as it is understood today, the specific mechanisms of X-linked recessive conditions, the carrier status of women who transmit without expressing, the 50% probability that applies to each male birth from a carrier mother was not available to the medicine of the Victorian era in any form that would have permitted the kind of premarital genetic assessment that subsequent generations have been able to conduct. Victoria did not know, her daughters did not know, her granddaughters did not know, Enna did not know. This is the fact that the entire architecture of Alfonso's blame required to be disregarded, and that the entire architecture of the Spanish court's treatment of Enna required to be disregarded, and that the historical record has subsequently disregarded, with a consistency that suggests the disregarding was never accidental. A verdict that acknowledges that Enna did not know what she was carrying when she married Alfonso is a verdict that makes Alfonso's blame irrational. An irrational blame directed at a woman who did nothing wrong requires an accounting that the Spanish court was not prepared to produce and that the historical record has not subsequently demanded. The science that Enna lacked was not obscure or esoteric in its absence from her premarital knowledge. It was simply the science of its period, incomplete, advancing rapidly, but not yet arrived at the specific understanding that would have made her carrier status identifiable before the first haemophiliac birth confirmed it retrospectively. The royal family of Britain in 1905 and 1906, when the Spanish match was being arranged and concluded, did not have access to genetic testing. No test existed. The identification of carrier status in women required either the birth of an affected son, which provided retrospective confirmation, or a family history clear enough to make the inference statistically supportable. Ina's family history was not clear enough. Her mother Beatrice had no haemophiliac sons and no established history of the condition in her immediate line. Her brothers were not haemophiliac at the time of the marriage. Leopold, who would later manifest the condition, had not yet done so in ways that would have been available to anyone assessing the Battenberg family's genetic profile in 1906. The information that would have made the inference possible was not yet in the record, and its absence from the record meant that the people arranging the match had no basis for the concern that subsequent events would have made obvious if it had been raised. The question of whether the match should have been more carefully assessed against the general background of Victoria's haemophilia legacy, the known affected grandsons, the pattern of the gene's appearance in the family across the preceding generation, is a question that the historical record has not examined with the attention it warrants. The pattern was visible, in retrospect, to anyone who assembled the family data with the specific question in mind. Whether anyone assembled it with that question in mind before the Spanish marriage was concluded has not been established in any source that has reached the public record. If the pattern was visible and was not examined, the people who arranged the match bear a responsibility that the subsequent blame directed at Ina displaced. If the pattern was examined and the risk was assessed as acceptable, the kind of actuarial tolerance for uncertainty that dynastic marriages of the period involved as a matter of routine, then the acceptance of the risk was an institutional decision rather than Ina's personal failure, and the blame that followed the risk's materialization was a displacement of institutional responsibility onto the individual who happened to be the gene's carrier. Either possibility is more damaging to the institution than the verdict the institution produced, which is presumably why neither possibility has been examined with the thoroughness that the historical record would benefit from. Institutions are not naturally inclined to examine their own decisions in ways that would require them to redistribute blame from the individuals they have blamed toward the institutional processes that produce the conditions for the blamed behavior. The broader Victorian haemophilia story, the gene's distribution across the European royal houses, its appearance in the Russian imperial family through Alexandra and Alexei, its presence in the Spanish royal family through Enna, has been told primarily as a medical story and a dynastic tragedy, rather than as an institutional story about the organization of royal marriages and the distribution of their risks. The medical and dynastic framing is not wrong. It is incomplete in the specific way that framings are incomplete when they describe consequences without examining causes. The cause, in the most immediate sense, was the gene itself, the random mutation that had appeared in Victoria or in one of her immediate ancestors, and that had then been distributed through the marriage network that Victoria's dynastic policy created. But the cause in the institutional sense was the marriage network itself, the system that organized the genetic pool of the European royal families through the arranged marriages of their daughters, that treated those daughters as the vehicles of dynastic connection rather than as individuals with interests that the dynastic connection might compromise, and that had no mechanism for assessing the genetic risks that the concentration of a limited gene pool within a self-reinforcing marriage network inevitably produced. Ina was a product of that system and a victim of it. She was produced by it in the sense that the dynastic ambition that sent a Battenberg girl across the Channel to become Queen of Spain was an ambition organized by the same logic that had organized the marriages of Victoria's daughters and granddaughters across the European houses for decades. She was victimized by it in the sense that the system had no mechanism for protecting her from the genetic consequence of the marriage it had arranged, and no mechanism for distributing the blame for that consequence equitably across the institutional processes that had produced it, and therefore produced a blame distribution that placed the entire weight of an institutional failure on the individual woman who happened to be standing at its intersection. The women of Victoria's generation who carried the haemophilia gene and transmitted it to affected sons in other royal houses have been treated, in the historical record, with varying degrees of the same misattribution that Ina received. Alexandra of Russia, who transmitted the gene to Alexei, and whose connection to Rasputin through her desperation to help her son became a factor in the conditions that produced the Russian Revolution, has been treated more harshly than Ina in the historical record, her religious mysticism and her political influence over Nicholas providing additional material for accounts that needed her to be more than simply unlucky. Ina has been treated more mildly, perhaps because the Spanish monarchy's collapse had causes more numerous and more obviously political than the question of the heir's health, and perhaps because her personal conduct across the reign was insufficiently dramatic to provide the material that Alexandra's story supplied. Both women were carriers of a gene they did not know they were carrying. Both were blamed for the consequences of carrying it by the men they married and the institutions those men headed. Both managed the consequences for their affected sons with a maternal devotion that the official accounts of their reigns have consistently undervalued relative to the political and dynastic dimensions of the same story. Both were treated by history as the authors of a tragedy they had not authored. The treatment reveals something about the relationship between gender and institutional accountability that the specific cases of Alexandra and Enna illustrate with particular clarity. When a dynastic failure produces a genetic dimension, the gene's carrier becomes the accountable party, regardless of whether the carrier could have known what she was carrying or could have prevented its transmission. The carrier is female. The accountability is gendered in the most fundamental available sense. It attaches to the woman because the gene attached to the woman, as though carrier status and culpability were the same category of biological fact. They are not the same category. Carrier status is a genetic reality. Culpability is a moral assessment. The conflation of the two served the interests of the men who directed the blame and the institutions that supported the direction, and the conflation has been perpetuated in the historical record with a durability that the underlying irrationality has not diminished. Enna carried the gene for 81 years. She carried it without knowing she was carrying it for the first 19, across the Channel and through the conversion and into the Spanish court. She carried it with the knowledge of what it meant for the remaining 62 years, carried it as the defining fact of her public identity, the thing she was known as in the country that had received her, and then turned the reception into an accusation. She could not put it down. The gene was not something she had chosen, and was not something she could unchoose. The blame attached to its presence was not something she had deserved, and was not something she could discharge through any act of will, or service, or sustained dignity. She carried both across a lifetime, that the carrying shaped more completely than any other single fact about her, and she carried both without surrendering the self-understanding that the carrying was designed to undermine. Victoria's legacy to the European royal houses included the women who transmitted her gene, and the kingdoms those women married into, and the children those women produced, and the medical tragedies that the transmission generated across a generation of royal sons. It also included, in the less examined dimension of the same legacy, the women themselves, the carriers who lived inside the blame that their carrier status attracted, who managed the medical consequences of what they had transmitted with a devotion the blame was designed to make invisible, who maintained across the years of the blame a quality of self-possession that the blame had been specifically directed at destroying. Enna was among them. She was the Spanish case, the girl from Balmoral who had crossed the Channel with a gene she did not know she was carrying, and had spent the subsequent 62 years living inside the consequences of its having crossed with her. She carried it. She did not choose it. She did not deserve the blame it attracted. She managed its consequences with more skill and more love than the blame acknowledged or the historical record has recorded. The gene is gone now, dissolved across the generations that the exile and the remarriages and the biological distance of time have produced. The Spanish royal family that Juan Carlos established does not carry it. The dynasty that Enna's queenship was blamed for compromising has been restored and has continued and has produced a constitutional monarchy that is among the most stable in contemporary Europe. The blood is clean. The queen who was blamed for making it otherwise is still owed the accounting that the clean blood's existence makes possible, the accounting that says the blood was never as bad as the blame required, that the woman who carried the gene was not the author of the tragedy the gene produced, and that the 25 years she gave to the dynasty that blamed her were 25 years of genuine service to an institution that had no adequate vocabulary for acknowledging genuine service when the server was the person it had decided to blame. The accounting is overdue by a century. It is available now for anyone willing to produce it.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.